This shrine holds the tale of his life, his battles and his sorrows, and tells of a time long forgotten by modern man. Now, after ages past, the saga can be told anew. The story of Connacht and the coming of the Wolf Age.
Myth 3, The Wolf Age, is a real-time tactical fantasy developed by MumboJumbo and published by Gathering of Developers in October 2001. The game is a prequel to Bungie Software's Myth, The Fallen Lords, and Myth 2, Soulblighter, but set 1,000 years prior to the events of the original duology, focusing on the mighty deeds of the legendary hero Connacht. Myth 3 follows Connacht's rise from tribal warlord to Emperor of the Cathbruig, beginning with his struggles against the savage Mircridia and progressing to his war with the destructive entity known as the Leveler. Players will encounter many famous figures from the series' lore, such as the original incarnations of the Fallen Lords, as well as relive previously mythical events like the creation of the Tain and the destruction of the Trow Empire. Though once shrouded in mystery, in Myth 3 Connacht's place in the history books is transformed into an intimate story of love, loyalty, and heroism, but one that is also darkened by tragedy, betrayal, and the inexorable forces that govern the fate of mankind. The Wolf Age was functionally very similar to the first two games in the Myth series, foregoing resource gathering or base building elements in favour of small-scale tactical warfare, where terrain, weather, and unit controls were the keys to victory. Featuring a 25-level story-driven single-player campaign and an online mode that supported both competitive and cooperative multiplayer, Myth 3 let players control a variety of unit types, from conventional warriors and archers to magic-wielding Avatara and flame-throwing dwarves. In the solo missions, players took command of either a band of heroes or skirmishing-sized parties of troops, and were forced to outthink and outmaneuver much larger and more powerful forces of beasts, undead, and armoured giants. As the third title in the trilogy, it attempted to adhere as closely as possible to the gameplay of its predecessors, but with even more intensely scripted encounter design, a higher level of difficulty, and for the first time in the franchise, utilising fully 3D polygonal unit models that were rendered in real time. The Wolf Age was a controversial title, having been announced in the wake of Bungie Software's acquisition by Microsoft Corporation, and developed in just under a year by a new studio with no connection to the series' original creators. But prior to release, MumboJumbo insisted that Myth 3 would not disappoint fans of the first two games, promising that it would retain the series' challenging and tactical gameplay, unique and multi-layered background lore, riotous multiplayer carnage, and, arguably most important of all, user-friendly modding tools. Myth 3 received mixed reactions upon release, with some magazines awarding it positive scores and saying The Wolf Age was a faithful successor to Bungie's games, but others rating it as mediocre or worse, arguing it was buggy, unpolished, and unoriginal. Computer Gaming World was one of the most commendatory of the major reviewers, awarding Myth 3 4 stars out of 5 and claiming it was one of the most engaging Myth experiences to date. Rafael Liberatore was wowed by the 3D graphics, stellar balancing, improved interface, and gripping story, though did admit that MumboJumbo had failed to ship the game with editing tools, and that the game's multiplayer was not only underdeveloped, but also, in his words, a muck pit. Despite this, as well as his acknowledgement of reports that Myth 3 suffered from serious stability issues, Liberatore claimed he had encountered only a handful of minor bugs, and that overall, the Wolf Age was vastly superior to the previous titles in the series. Australia's Hyper magazine agreed that MumboJumbo had at the very least crafted a strong successor to Bungie's games, giving it a score of 85%. Like CGW, Dan Toos was especially impressed by Myth 3's cutting-edge 3D graphics, as well as its faithful adherence to the challenging and tactical gameplay of the earlier Myths. He did however note that MumboJumbo had failed to iterate on the achievements of the original developers, complaining that the series still lacked RTS staples like an instant action or skirmish mode, and contrary to Liberatore's claim, warned that the Wolf Age was screaming for a patch or two. Moreover, Toos conceded that the gameplay was too similar to the first two games, and that it would likely hold little attraction to those who had already tired of the formula pioneered by Bungie. In spite of these problems, he characterised Myth 3 as an excellent RTS with a superbly told narrative, asserting that for Myth fans there was indeed life after Bungie. But Britain's PC Zone were far more critical, scoring Myth 3 a mere 70% and saying it had fallen short in scope, scale and execution. Keith Pullin determined that the game's uncomplicated action would be a welcome diversion for those who valued flashy, blood-soaked visuals and straightforward battlefield tactics over strategic depth, but that even these attractions were undermined by a nonsensical and unimaginative story, disappointing single-player missions, and underutilised unit command system. Pullin felt that Myth 3's uninspired design was particularly galling in light of recent releases like GSC's Cossacks and Creative Assembly's Shogun Total War, which he argued spectacularly outclassed the Wolf Age in complexity and ambition. And two even more devastating reviews came from PC Gamer, whose US and UK branches both rated Myth 3 a disappointing 58%. William Harms and David McCarthy were equally enthused by the 3D graphics, fountains of blood and gore, and impressive unit variety, but also slammed the game for crippling bugs, a shallow, monotonous narrative, cumbersome and counterintuitive controls, and a general lack of creativity. Harms was particularly baffled by what he saw as a regression from the improvements made by Myth 2's interface and unit commands, saying the frustrations of friendly fire and unresponsive AI were somehow worse than ever, whilst McCarthy was infuriated by the game's schizophrenic pacing and difficulty spikes. However, like his predecessors at PC Gamer UK, McCarthy was also critical of the limited scope of the Myth series, arguing titles like Shogun and Stainless Steel's Empire Earth represented the future of the RTS genre. William Harms, on the other hand, cited Myth 1 and 2 as personal favourites, and worried that MumboJumbo's shoddy, rushed, inconsistent, and unpolished work may have ended the franchise on a sour note. International opinions of Myth 3 also varied considerably, with France's Joystick rating it 80%, agreeing with English reviewers that MumboJumbo had not done much to improve upon the mechanics established by Bungie, but that they had nevertheless crafted a tense, challenging, and occasionally epic single-player campaign. The magazine was especially impressed by the game's visuals, highlighting the polygonal models, advanced shadow effects, and detailed battlegrounds, though criticised the low production values of the cinematics, and remarked that Myth's quasi-isometric perspective was a step behind true 3D titles like Massive Entertainment's Ground Control. The review also noted the developers' failure to launch the game with a map editor, weak and incomplete sound design, and the stifling linearity of the mission design, but predicted that the former would be remedied by patches, and the latter, in time, by the Myth modding community. Spain's Micromania were slightly less forgiving of Myth 3's faults than Joystick, but still scored it at a respectable 70%. The review praised the game for its addictive tactical gameplay, co-op and competitive online options, 3D unit models, beautiful environments, and epic soundtrack, noting that the latter more than made up for any deficiencies in its sound design. Though highly critical of the cumbersome camera and unwieldy interface, as well as the poor localization of the European release, the magazine concluded that the Wolf Age retained enough of its predecessor's strengths to be a commendable and hopefully long-lived addition to the RTS genre. Gen 4 were also somewhat equivocal in their assessment of Myth 3, rating it 14 out of 20 for its visually sumptuous but somewhat unoriginal battlefield carnage. David LaRue noted that the game featured only one major new feature, its 3D engine, and that this not only came over a year after Ground Control, console, but also shared this innovation with other recent competitors, like Liquid Entertainment's Battle Realms. The review also complained that the game's awkward controls, fratricidal-friendly AI, unforgiving opening missions, and general mechanics were confusing and unwelcoming to newcomers, and that its camera was zoomed in so close to the action, even veteran players might struggle to command their units effectively. LaRue concluded that Myth 3 was an unremarkable and uninspired RTS, but added that many of its shortcomings were actually inherited from the older titles, and that MumboJumbo had made a valiant effort to emulate Bungie's original design. Bohemia's GameStar, however, did not credit MumboJumbo for their fidelity to the franchise's roots, giving Myth 3 45% and eviscerating it as boring, ugly, and eminently forgettable. The review was relentless in its complaints, cataloguing, among other things, brainless AI opponents, sluggish, badly animated units, repetitive and poorly lit environments, barren and muddy audioscapes, and finally tired storytelling delivered by an equally dispirited narrator. Andre Mack averred that reviewing Myth 3 had been a deeply unpleasant experience, and joked that it would undoubtedly be Game of the Year, to precisely no one. Shortly after its release, Myth 3 received a map editor, a patch, and extra multiplayer maps, as well as a port to the Apple Macintosh in January 2002. Official support for both versions was dropped soon afterwards, however, as was the GameSpy service around which their multiplayer functionality was based. The Myth franchise as a whole is widely considered a dormant IP in publisher Take-Two's portfolio, and as of winter 2023, MumboJumbo's The Wolf Age is not available for purchase outside the second-hand market. Nowadays, many fans of the series view Myth 3 as a sad and ignominious end to a beloved series, and fan sites typically recommend ignoring the title in favour of Bungie's original games. Yet it was a project that faced severe challenges from the moment of its inception, budgetary and otherwise, and its franchise-killing launch was not quite the end of its story. To tell the tale of the game's painful conception and why so many fans rejected it, in today's video we'll start by taking a look back at how the Wolf Age came into being and what came afterwards. After that, we'll move on to the final product, running under flying flips on official 1.3.1 patch, and consider its gameplay, art and sound, different ways to experience it, and finally its story. As usual, feel free to watch the video from beginning to end, or check the timestamps below to find the part that interests you. With that said, let's travel back over 20 years into the past, and examine the conditions that led to the making of Myth 3.
Campbell. I'm with MumboJumbo Games, and I'm the project manager and lead designer of Myth 3: The Wolf Age.
Technically speaking, the story of Myth 3 begins in the summer of 2000, when the Myth series' original progenitor, Bungie Software, announced their acquisition by Microsoft Corporation. Bungie would be moving from Chicago to Washington, but their cherished Myth franchise would not be going with them. Instead, the rights to Myth would be making the journey to New York, the headquarters of publisher Take-Two Interactive. It was only then that plans for what became the third game in the series were set in motion. But understanding the circumstances that led to Myth 3 and how it was perceived by audiences at the time requires going even further back into the series' history. There were several ingredients to its first entry, 1997's Myth: The Fallen Lords, that would become synonymous with its appeal, elements that many fans quickly came to consider sacred and inalienable features of the series. The engine that powered Myth was notable for modelling height-mapped 3D terrain and a free-roaming rotatable camera, rather than the fixed isometric perspective of most RTS games at the time, as well as focusing on small-scale, tightly scripted tactical challenge rather than traditional command and conquer style strategy or complicated wargaming mechanics. This combination of 3D battlefields and accessible RTS action prompted Bungie to dub Myth the first fully multi-metric real-time tactical game. In addition, the Fallen Lords rejected traditional high fantasy storytelling, instead rooting itself in a blend of Celtic and Mesoamerican mythology, then filtered through a grim and unromantic romantic dark fantasy tale modelled on author Glenn Cook's The Black Company. But perhaps most crucial of all for some fans, Myth was used as the launchpad for online platform Bungie.net, which the studio envisioned as a one-click multiplayer server that included chat rooms, player rankings, software updates, and community extensions in a single convenient package, shared between gamers on both Macintosh and PC. Myth's multiplayer battles and the community Bungie.net helped solidify would turn out to be essential to the franchise. But Bungie also had plans for the Myth engine beyond the studio itself. The combination of cutting-edge 3D engine and tactical action-packed real-time gameplay seemed ripe for further monetization, either by licensing the engine out to third parties or subcontracting smaller developers to produce additional content for the game. Two of these instances, though apparently unrelated to one another, would have implications for the future of the Myth series. The first was an unsuccessful attempt at producing an official expansion pack for the Fallen Lords, which was to be developed by a small developer named Logicware. Co-founded by Interplay luminary Bill Heineman, the studio's development wing was headed by Scott Campbell, the original lead designer on Fallout. Logicware mostly worked on budget titles or Macintosh and Windows ports, and more significantly, the 3DO to home computer conversion of open-world shooter Killing Time. But towards the end of the Fallen Lords development, Bungie had discussed plans for add-on packs with several different studios, and an interim agreement was made with Heineman's company, who commenced work on the project. Campbell characterizes the expansion as revolving around a hero uniting the last bastions of humanity against the Fallen Lords, alongside standard fantasy tropes of, quote, building alliances, finding the magic MacGuffin, and beating up the bad guy. Featuring 10 new single-player levels and 4 multiplayer maps, along with a smattering of new units, it would also have included the amphibious Scrael, a unit Bungie had created but then cut from the Fallen Lords campaign. This expansion was ultimately cancelled, however, with Scott Campbell admitting that one factor leading to this was Logicware's failure to recognise how much Bungie valued Myth's storytelling and background lore. Campbell has conceded that when his team visited Bungie's offices in Chicago to discuss the expansion, he had been focused on Myth's gameplay, and discounted the game's setting as a generic fantasy world of elves and dwarves. By Campbell's account, this led to some embarrassing conversations with Myth's lead, who quizzed him on his knowledge of everything from Julius Caesar's commentary on the Gallic War to the mythical Tuatha De Danann, subjects Campbell admits he was ill-equipped to discuss. Halfway through development, Bungie were apparently unhappy with Logicware's progress on the expansion, which Campbell states he was not surprised by, as the team struggled with development tools and his overall design, in his own words, really wasn't good. Bungie terminated the project, though had, according to Campbell, treated Logicware more fairly than most companies they'd worked with, and the two studios went their separate ways. But in the meantime, Campbell's visit had inspired him to take a second look at Myth's lore, as well as the legends that had inspired it. The second, and far better known spin-off of note, was the Daimyo project. This later endeavour was not an expansion pack to Myth, but a total conversion, funded by Bungie and developed by fans, which took place in the Warring States period of feudal Japan. As with Logicware's project, Daimyo suffered a number of setbacks and was eventually cancelled, but it would not be the last time the possibility of third parties taking responsibility for a Myth title was raised. Myth launched at the end of 1997 to strong sales and critical acclaim, though by this point the RTS genre as a whole was beginning to catch up to Bungie's innovations, with numerous titles in production that met or exceeded the Fallen Lords' ambition in either technology or design. Always hungry to push boundaries, Fallen Lords lead Jason Jones thus began overhauling the Myth engine in order to develop a sci-fi spiritual successor to Myth, known internally as Blam or Project Armor among other names, whilst producer Tuncer Dennis took the lead on Myth 2 Soulblighter. Although a fairly conservative sequel in most respects, Bungie had certainly not abandoned their dreams of leveraging Myth's fanbase, and promised that Soulblighter would launch with a powerful set of map editing tools, Fear and Loathing, and the studio revisited the idea of commercializing third-party content for Myth. Myth 2 released in late 1998 and should have been another major success for the studio, enjoying positive review scores, strong sales, a healthy multiplayer community, and an explosion of fan-made content courtesy of its map-making tools. But Bungie had taken a substantial financial blow shortly before the game's official launch, as a critical hard drive wiping bug had been exposed at the last minute, forcing a recall of launch copies that cost Bungie approximately $800,000. The extent to which the company was damaged by this event has been discussed, disputed, but several Bungie staff have stated that the recall was a factor in the sale of almost 20% of Bungie's stock to Take-Two Interactive. Weakened Bungie once again saw the value of letting third parties work on Myth, as well as profiting from fan-made content, be it in the form of add-ons or spin-offs. The studio briefly entertained a pitch for a Myth 2 expansion, entitled Chimera, from modding group the Badlands Collective, which was eventually put up online as a free download, and went on to release Myth, the Total Codex, which repackaged the entire Myth series, along with a variety of the most popular community-made add-ons. But concurrent to the development, release, and re-release of Myth 2, the Blam project had continued to grow and evolve. In the years since Jason Jones had begun working on it, the game had morphed from a sci-fi myth to, at first, a third-person tactical RTS, then to an action-adventure, and finally into its final form, the first-person shooter Halo. The Soulblighter team, now codenamed Team Phoenix, had initially discussed the possibility of making a third Myth game, reportedly going so far as to draft a pitch document, which began circulating on the Discord channel of the Fourth Curtain podcast, run by former Bungie CEO Alex Seropian, in mid-2023. This idea never went further than a pitch document at best, with later team members apparently unaware that it had even been discussed in the first place. Perhaps due to Bungie's general distaste for churning out sequels, a hypothetical Myth 3 was quickly put aside in favour of exploring new IPs, such as a fantasy siege game with destructible environments, and the Phoenix team were eventually moved to other projects. Thus, with Halo's reveal at Macworld 1999, where it generated mass hysteria among consumers and the press, both internal and external buzz had shifted away from the Myth series. By the time Microsoft Corporation approached Bungie about a possible acquisition, it was not Myth, nor Bungie West's Oni that was considered the studio's crown jewel, but rather their still unreleased sci-fi shooter, which Microsoft eyed as a potential launch title for their upcoming Xbox. The proverbial fly in the ointment, of course, was Take-Two, who effectively owned 20% of Bungie. Take-Two had spent a considerable amount of money acquiring this stake in the studio, and were loath to relinquish their grip, whilst Microsoft, for their part, had no interest in merely purchasing a piece of Bungie. The accommodation reached by the two companies, formally announced in summer 2000, was that Microsoft would acquire Bungie in its entirety, including Halo, but that Take-Two would be compensated with, among other properties, the rights to the Myth franchise. Unsurprisingly, the announcement was not taken well by some fans, both those who worried for Bungie's future under Microsoft, and those who were concerned by Take-Two's potential handling of the Myth franchise. Perhaps most infuriated were those Mythers who had, prior to the formal announcement of the move, insisted that the studio would never betray their fans with such an act. Although Take-Two and Bungie tried to massage the transition with various concessions to the community, such as the promise that Bungie.net would continue to support the Myth series for the immediate future, the reality was that Bungie had formally disinherited their bloody bouncing baby. Take-Two now considered how best to make use of their new property, and in summer 2000, the Myth franchise entered a new phase of its life. At the margins, the publisher looked at generating further revenue by continuing Bungie's policy of licensing the engine out to fans or third parties, which would eventually lead to the commercial release of Green Berets, a total conversion for Myth 2 that was set during the Vietnam War. Their priority, however, was to strike whilst the iron was still relatively hot, and make a third game in the series. Rather than develop Myth 3 internally at Rockstar or another of their subsidiaries, Take-Two delegated responsibility to Gathering of Developers. GOD had a colourful reputation, founded in 1998 as an alternative to traditional publishers, run by and for developers, but had endured considerable financial turmoil and by May 2000 was, ironically but perhaps inevitably, now the property of Take-Two. Through GOD, Take-Two quietly announced that they would be soliciting proposals for the third title in the Myth series. Bill Heinemann's Contraband Entertainment, formerly Logicware, were one of several companies that became aware of this development, along with Contraband creative director Scott Campbell. In an interview conducted by Bungie fan channel Gyoku in July 2020, Campbell states that it was not he, but actually an associate at Contraband who originally suggested making a pitch for Myth 3. Contraband were but one of several parties who responded to GOD, and though there are few details as to the other pitches, at least one of Contraband's competitors had suggested redirecting the series towards a more conventional RTS, with staple activities like resource resource gathering. Contextually, the idea of revising experimental RTS titles to match traditional gameplay styles was certainly not unheard of by the early 2000s. In the Fallen Lord's day, it was widely believed that the prevalence of Warcraft or Command & Conquer clones were generating RTS fatigue among consumers, and that more original titles, especially those utilizing 3D engines, represented the future of the genre. But 3 years later, many such projects, even those that were well received by reviewers, had failed to match the success of titles following more conventional RTS trends. Although a handful, such as Creative Assembly's Shogun Total War, achieved modest success and went on to become established brands, by and large the titans of the RTS genre were the same names that had dominated sales charts since the mid-90s. Traditional RTS games continued to sell, and due to their comparatively low production costs, even some isometric 2D titles were still being greenlit in the early 2000s. As CNET editor William Harms pointed out, conventional wisdom was that the genre was fast collapsing under the weight of its own mediocrity, with the landscape dominated by either safe and unambitious sequels or third-party clones of the big names. Yet it was these same sequels and C&C clones that still seemed to sell best. The trend had not gone unnoticed by industry insiders, manifesting in riskier approaches either being cancelled or reworked to appeal to an audience who, via their wallets, had signalled their desire for more of the same. Electronic Arts' Dungeon Keeper franchise, for example, was as far from Command & Conquer as an RTS could get, but by November 99, the series' sales had not kept pace with expectations, and prior to its cancellation, developers at Bullfrog had been instructed to rework the third game to make it more accessible to traditional RTS fans, taking design cues from StarCraft and Age of Empires. Financially, the original Myth had been a hit, but its sales were in the low hundreds of thousands, far short of the million plus of the big names. Thus, the idea of reshaping the Myth franchise into a title with mass appeal may well have held some attraction to Take-Two. In contrast, Scott Campbell's pitch for Myth 3 envisioned a game that stayed faithful to the series' roots, retaining the same gameplay mechanics as the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter. Contraband suggested 3 possible routes for Myth 3's campaign. Either a direct continuation of Myth 2's narrative, a story set in the far future, and thus following the subsequent cycle of the light and the dark, or a prequel taking place long before the events of the Fallen Lords. The license holder favoured the latter option, and Campbell put together a detailed pitch for the title. The vision Doc Campbell pitched to GOD, which he stated in his 2020 interview ran to around 130 pages, was heavily story-focused, a grand narrative that brought to life the myths and legends that gave birth to the events of Myth 1. Campbell's intent was to craft a definitive account of several earth-shattering events from Myth's backstory, conflicts of biblical proportions that resulted in the fall of millennia-old empires and the annihilation of entire races. According to Campbell, gathering of developers were keen on his pitch, but either they, or possibly Take-Two, had reservations about Contraband's ability to actually deliver on the idea. Although individual members of Contraband, such as Campbell or Heinemann, were veterans of the industry, as a company the studio had never shipped any notable home computer titles, and were instead best known for their work porting PC games to the Macintosh. Programmer Andrew Meggs, for example, had put considerable work into a Mac port of Valve's Half-Life that was cancelled at the last minute, whilst either he or other members of the team had shipped conversions of Ritual Entertainment's Sin and Heavy Metal FAC 2, but never actually developed a major title from start to finish by themselves. Artist Devon Winters characterised Contraband's history up to that point as having made merely, quote, quick and dirty titles. To place the future of the Myth franchise in the hands of a small and unproven developer like Contraband was simply too risky for the license holder. Yet the story was to take another strange turn, for Campbell and his team were rescued by the intervention of 2 prominent members of the GOD family. Ritual Entertainment founder and GOD board member Mark Doctorman, alongside business partner Ron Diamond, himself a former CEO at both Ritual Entertainment and MacPlay, had plans to found a new studio, and suggested a marriage of convenience with Contraband. The 2 men would open a development office in Irvine, California, which would then be filled by both ex-Ritual staff and Campbell's team from Contraband. With the backing of Doctorman and Diamond, who had a proven record of shipping big-budget titles, this move would assuage any fears on the part of the license holders as to the group's ability to deliver on Campbell's pitch for Myth 3. Andrew Meggs later joked that the move was a fairly pointless one, that Contraband were essentially transplanted wholesale, all the way down to bookkeepers and receptionists, from their previous lodgings to the new office in Irvine, but that it was just one of the strange requirements of doing business in the industry. The name of the new studio went through several iterations, ranging from Ritual West to United Developers, and finally to MumboJumbo, a name reportedly chosen by Doctorman and Diamond that, according to several different sources, the team themselves disliked, believing it sounded ridiculous and was a bad omen. Nevertheless, Campbell and the newly founded MumboJumbo now had the green light to commence work on Myth 3. But by his telling, Campbell's elation soon turned to shock when he was informed of the project's budget. Gathering of developers liked Campbell's pitch for Myth 3, which he admits he consciously made sound as grand as possible in order to secure the contract. But whereas Campbell envisioned the game as, in modern parlance, a AAA title, Campbell's paymasters wanted it finished on what he referred to as a shoestring C- budget. To fulfill their obligations, Campbell states that MumboJumbo estimated the project would have to be completed within exactly 11 months to hit the lucrative Christmas 2001 release window, and that to do so meant removing what could be removed, cutting costs on what could not, and doing it all as quickly as possible. MumboJumbo were locked into delivering Myth 3 under conditions that none of its staff considered remotely ideal, and they had to start work immediately. Thus, in November 2000, Scott Campbell hastily refashioned his original pitch into something more realistic, but still in line with his promise to the license holder, and the team began staffing up for development. According to Andrew Meggs, in composition the small team were largely comprised of former Contraband employees, with some ex-Ritual staff from the Sin and Heavy Metal Fact 2 teams, producers from Gathering Developers or other Take-Two subsidiaries, and a few new hires. MumboJumbo's founders, however, were reportedly not significantly involved in Myth 3's development, as they were busy overseeing other projects under the Ritual or GOD umbrella over in Dallas, Texas, where they would later found a second MumboJumbo office. Campbell's revised vision doc for the team outlined the project's key requirements: a 25-level single-player campaign, 5 netgame maps with Myth's classic game modes, and a move to polygonal 3D models. The document was unusually open about the difficult conditions under which the project was to be conducted, bluntly stating that its extremely short development window necessitated a low-risk approach to all areas of the game's design. Perhaps the greatest asset the studio had on their side was that the game was to be built on the existing Myth 2 Soulblighter engine, utilising many of the same tools that had already been in use for several years by Bungie and the fan community. MumboJumbo's strategy was to make the game in the barely modified Myth 2 engine for the first few months, then graft graphical enhancements to it prior to the game's public reveal. Here, the team's relationship with GOD, as well as some members' experience working on Fact 2, would come in handy, as Myth 3 would be able to make use of that game's Tiki animation system for its 3D models, which was itself an evolution of the system used for Sin. But even with these assets, the importance of cost-cutting, time-saving, and Hail Mary fallback strategies was also made abundantly clear. The game's features were divided into essential components and optional enhancements, with virtually all of the latter completely isolated from the base technology upon which the game was being built, designed with, in effect, a trapdoor that meant they could be easily dropped from the game and replaced with an existing asset. Some of the new features mentioned in the design doc were deformable terrain and foliage that could be affected by wind or explosions, battlefield deployables such as artillery emplacements and traps, and overhauling Myth's multiplayer to be based around tribes or factions of troops rather than the arbitrary mix of units used in previous games. In other pre-release material, such as a much later interview between Campbell and Extreme Gaming Radio, a handful of other enhancements were mentioned, including persistent multiplayer progression, with veterancy for troops that survived across matches, and personalised combat AI for each unit, with some troop types being skittish or cautious attackers, others relentless or unconcerned for their own well-being. But even after this division of enhancements into a handful of critical features versus optional additions, there were still concerns that MumboJumbo might have to scale back its plans. Even Myth 3's single, major, and unambiguous upgrade over the previous game, its switch to 3D, was appended with the caveat that performance issues might necessitate a hybrid polygonal and sprite-based approach for more demanding scenes. And despite the project's cautious conservatism, a major wildcard remained: the actual base for its online mode. Bungie.net had always been the linchpin of Myth's multiplayer, but unlike Myth, it had accompanied Bungie over to Microsoft. The Vision doc could only speculate as to several possible scenarios: acquiring the source code for the purposes of building some sort of clone of Bungie.net, arranging a deal with Microsoft to host Myth 3 on their servers, utilizing the GameSpy service, or even dropping support for an online community entirely. The final option would be a significant blow to a group that had been a great boon to the series' popularity and longevity, for the Myth brand was built in part on the success of its online mode, as well as the map-making community it had engendered. Whilst Campbell and his team were agonizing over how to build Myth 3, the Soulblighter modding scene continued cranking out new content, from multiplayer map packs to total conversions. And few better understood the importance of these industrious fans than MumboJumbo themselves, as they would look to that community for key members of Myth 3's design team. Joining ex-Contraband and Ritual staff on the project were three leading figures from Myth's modding scene. Firstly, duo Paul Callender and Richard Cowgill, both coming from the well-known Vista map-making collective. And thirdly, Craig Goodman of Clan Played, creator of the popular World War II Recon and Titans conversions. This trio brought two major benefits to MumboJumbo. First, they were all intimately familiar with the ins and outs of Myth 2's map-making tools, and thus could immediately begin churning out levels based on Campbell's outlines. Second, MumboJumbo were acutely aware of the fact that community sentiment would be against any developer attempting to step into Bungie's shoes. They were an unknown and unproven interloper to the franchise. But by hiring Callender, Cowgill, and Goodman, MumboJumbo were effectively marrying into the Myth community and, in theory, providing themselves some legitimacy with fans. Production on Myth 3 thus commenced in late 2000, with Richard Cowgill later noting that every single member of the team had been indoctrinated with the understanding that they needed a finished product within 11 months, with absolutely no time for mistakes nor revisions. Cowgill recalls development being fun but intense, with extended periods of 70-plus hour work weeks. Scott Campbell, however, would later joke that the project was more akin to a death march, whilst Craig Matchett also remembers regularly working up to 3 AM in the morning, along with several team members, such as Craig Goodman, sleeping in the office rather than going home. Matchett has a particularly vivid recollection of a large arcade cabinet being stationed next to his desk, which would incessantly blast sound effects from Gauntlet as he tried to work. The first few months of development, from late 2000 to early 2001, were focused on level design, as well as working on the technology and assets that were intended for implementation in spring or summer of that year. This meant that Myth 3's development was, for this period, almost archipelagic in its form, with Andrew Meggs noting that what existed during this time were essentially a large collection of Myth 2 maps, alongside random folders of 3D models, VFX, and detached lines of code with nowhere to put them. Compounding these problems was the fact that though the levels were being designed using slightly modified versions of Myth 2's Fear and Loathing, existing tools were still insufficient for many of the tasks the team were working on. This led to ad hoc solutions by individual team members that would be difficult to consolidate into a single working toolset further down the line. Furthermore, the team themselves were not always focused exclusively on Myth 3. Bill Heineman and one or two other team members were simultaneously doing programming for several Mac-related projects, whilst Cowgill has admitted that he and Callender were also privately working to finish Jin, their long-awaited Myth 2 conversion, which did not amuse their superiors at the company. In spite of these problems, Scott Campbell recalls being both surprised and relieved by the progress the Myth 3 team made after its inception, characterizing it as well on the way to hitting its target once full production commenced. Both Campbell and Cowgill cite the shift to 3D and associated technological innovations as the feature the team were especially proud of, giving particular credit to Andrew Meggs for this achievement. By this point, in early 2001, the major details of Myth 3 were known to the public.
In a time long past, 1,000 years before the armies of the light and dark raged over the world of myth, there was only darkness.
Although there had been speculation as to the existence of the third game almost as soon as Take-Two had acquired the rights, and leaks and rumours had filtered through to the Myth community by November 2000, Myth 3 was not formally announced to the press until January 2001. Initially there was little to show, partly because there was not much that was appropriate for prime time, and partly because the team were consciously holding material back for a grand reveal at the E3 Expo in May of that year. A website was launched and a teaser trailer uploaded, Reloaded, showcasing the first of Myth 3's animated 3D models. Several members of the team began providing interviews to fan sites and the press, and the game's core features were now known. The epic scope of its story, the switch to 3D, MumboJumbo's intent to model it on the gameplay and features of the previous titles, and that it would launch simultaneously on both Windows PCs and Macintosh. The final point was important for, as the original design doc pointed out, a considerable proportion of Myth's fanbase were still on the Mac, the platform upon which Bungie had first found success. Indeed, some were, in the late 90s, personally invested in the Apple brand, perceiving it as philosophically in opposition to the soulless corporatism of Microsoft. This was also true of Myth's fan community, some of whom had begun modding Bungie games during the Marathon era, and certain Myth map-making tools were still exclusive to Mac OS. From the earliest interviews and press releases, MumboJumbo stressed how committed they were to providing the same gameplay experience Myth veterans were used to, and that virtually everything fans might expect from a game set in the Myth universe would be present. All the staple combatants of the light and dark, plus the nightmarish Mircridia, the titanic Trow, and the great heroes and villains of the Myth world at the height of their power. But even at this early stage, MumboJumbo were clearly battling uphill against some pre-existing negativity towards the project. First was, as they had predicted, anxiety over a Myth game not made by Bungie, platitudes from the original developer notwithstanding. Most press coverage politely observed that the company were essentially carrying someone else's brand on their shoulders, and fans, whether of the gameplay or story, were often somewhat harsher. Scott Campbell recalls, for example, that his attempts to justify the inclusion of certain iconic, but for a prequel title, anachronistic characters in Myth 3 did not help to convince skeptics that MumboJumbo knew what they were doing with the setting. Second, Take-Two's earlier concern that the Myth 3 team did not have the most illustrious pedigree in the industry resurfaced in numerous previews, which frequently referred to MumboJumbo as a new or unseasoned developer, at best mentioning Campbell's involvement in Fallout, or MumboJumbo's links to Ritual Entertainment's Sin and Fac 2. But a third concern, communicated only by a minority of previews, and yet perhaps the most damaging, was the perception that the Myth franchise was simply not all that important anymore. As early as Myth 2's release, a handful of reviewers had argued that the 3D tactics pioneered by the Fallen Lords had lost their novelty value, and by 2001 this view had become more widespread, especially in light of the series' competitors. In their March 2001 preview, for example, PC Zone remarked that the Wolf Age would continue the series' prioritization of ease of play, rather than, as they put it, the strategic depth offered by recent releases like Creative Assembly's Shogun. In a 2011 Q&A, Richard Cowgill conceded that, even at the time, there was a growing perception that Myth's gameplay mechanics were somewhat played out, and that creating a prequel was merely, to quote, stretching it just a bit. Myth fan site Bungie.org also noticed that, in RTS coverage, titles like Ground Control or Shogun were increasingly credited for their 3D innovations in place of the Myth games. Tweaks to control and unit management aside, in design, MumboJumbo were under no illusions that Myth 3 could be marketed as a groundbreaking or especially innovative title, as any sort of revolutionary take on the squad tactical RTS, in Scott Campbell's words. Rather, as Campbell made clear, their best asset in this regard was the game's cutting-edge visuals. Further 3D renders, as well as in-engine screenshots of the Wolf Age, had begun to appear by spring 2001, as MumboJumbo had made progress in integrating their 3D assets and animation system into the modified Myth 2 engine. Spreading awareness of these promotional shots, however, turned out to be yet another challenge for the team. In his 2020 interview, Campbell reveals that Gathering of Developers, or perhaps Take-Two, had, in his view, effectively forgotten that the Myth 3 team even existed, claiming that when attempting to contact the publisher, nobody seemed to know who MumboJumbo were, let alone what they were working on and why they were being paid.
And so, because we'd call them up and we'd say, hey, we're the guys doing Myth 3, and we got a lot of who? Doing what? Who are you guys again?
Of particular consequence was the fact that, as Myth 3's pre-E3 push should have been gathering steam, Campbell discovered GOD did not have any marketing staff assigned to the game, instead instructing Campbell and his team to take care of it themselves. This resulted in team members being pulled off development tasks to instead cobble together promotional material for the game, ranging from print ads to trailers to web design and everything in between. Although Campbell did not discuss it, it may be these issues occurred due to problems within GOD itself. Rumours of infighting and power struggles with Take-Two were mentioned by gaming sites and industry forums that same year, and it was no secret that medium-sized publishers were increasingly being forced out of the industry. Gathering of developers were particularly vulnerable, as they were known for not pushing their partners to hit sales deadlines. Many of these studios were not financially independent, instead reliant on GOD for infusions of cash, and in the view of their rivals, the publisher also had a poor record of picking potential hits. During a particularly difficult period in May of that year, GOD co-founder Doug Myers died of a sudden asthma attack, which would lead to further organizational problems within the company. Simply put, Gathering of developers were not making enough money, or so Take-Two claimed, and their leadership fast feeling the pressure from Take-Two and elsewhere, meaning that resources for third-party projects were tight. The limitations of Myth 3's small budget, especially as it pertains to production values, had been clear from the start, but the consequences of this sometimes did not become obvious until much later. Campbell had, for example, originally intended to tell the epic story of the Wolf Age partly through cinematics, just as the previous games had. When he received the project's budget, it was obvious the team could not afford to pay for this, but Campbell assumed he could fall back on the series' established use of interstitial screens, with static sketches and scrolling text to tell the story, and eventually make use of in-game cutscenes. But many months later, when the rest of the game seemed to be coming together, it became clear that Myth 3's storytelling would not be up to the series' standards. Scripting in-game cutscenes was proving to be more challenging than expected. In-engine cinematics were also expensive and time-consuming, and the lengthy narrative cards used to substitute cutscenes were not only painfully heavy on dull and yet overly dramatic exposition, but also still left noticeable gaps in the game's plot. MumboJumbo stretched their budget by hiring a third party, artists at the firm New Pencil, to produce more illustrations that could be used to paper over some of these weaknesses. But Campbell knew, even at this stage of development, it would not be received well upon the game's release. He hoped that by succeeding in the project's core aims of delivering a fun, faithful, and visually impressive Myth game, audiences would be able to look past such issues. The team's best chance to capture the attention of the press and consumers, as well as prove to fans they had successfully captured the spirit of the Myth franchise, was of course E3 2001.
When the devils stare into your eyes, show them only your rage and your hate. Make them know that it is they who should be fearful of you.
Like many other Gathering of developer titles, Myth 3 was not formally presented on the E3 show floor. It had a small presence on site, but was being more heavily marketed in GOD's infamous Promised Lot, which was a parking lot just outside the convention centre where GOD attracted press with a promise of beer, babes, and barbecue. But attracting visitors to the MumboJumbo stand was something of a struggle. In some cases, convention goers, at least those not distracted by keg parties or strippers dressed as Catholic schoolgirls, would wander over believing that the game was related to Cyan's popular point-and-click Myst franchise, and lost interest when informed otherwise. The development would likely have been no surprise to Cyan, whose legal team had sent a letter to Bungie many years earlier raising their concerns over similarities between the two titles. Andrew Meggs expressed disappointment at how few people came to view the game at E3, suggesting it was the result of the lack of marketing and PR on GOD's part. Nevertheless, a few young men were enticed into the MumboJumbo trailer with the lure of Dr. Pepper and board games, to watch Myth 3 being demoed with a new gameplay movie.
And Myth 3 is actually a prequel to the very well-selling Myth games, and it actually takes place 1,000 years before Myth 1, The Fallen Lords. It actually focuses on the life and exploits of our hero Connaught. And all of those Fallen Lords that were the bad guys from the previous Myth games are actually heroes in this game, so you'll actually get to play Soul Blighter as a good guy.
By that point, MumboJumbo could showcase much of the game's technological prowess in real time, from its 3D models and tiki-backed skeletal animations to the physics and lighting effects. They were also able to clarify more details of the game's setting and story, multiplayer features, and, in major news, confirm earlier reports that the game was to ship with a suite of modding tools, a modified version of Myth 2's Fear and Loathing that would be referred to as Vengeance, alongside a 3D Studio Max plugin for importing new 3D assets assets into the game. However, some features remained up in the air, from certain details of the game's multiplayer modes to what service would actually be hosting them. Aside from the gaming press and a few online celebrities, such as Mike Kraholic and Jerry Hawkins, most of those who came specifically to see Myth 3 were part of either Bungie or Myth fan sites. Reports from both professional and community critics were soon appearing online or in print, giving MumboJumbo feedback on how the game was being received by the public. In a much later article, Computer Gaming World admitted they had been unimpressed by Myth 3's E3 showing, though by and large magazines were positive or non-committal. Most dutifully mirrored press releases and earlier articles, listing Myth 3's bullet point features, highlighting its 3D graphics and commitment to mimicking the gameplay of the originals, and occasionally making oblique references to MumboJumbo's lack of experience and the extremely short development window. Fan reactions were more varied, particularly over the shift to 3D models. Frequent debates broke out over whether real-time polygonal units were an improvement over the pre-rendered models of the original games, with some team members, including Andrew Meggs, occasionally breaking in to defend the team's work. Generally speaking, however, fan impressions from the demo were positive, with Inside Mac Games' Michael Yanovich describing it as amazing, and Mac Gamer's John Han insisting that any concerns he'd had about MumboJumbo had been definitively put to rest. Follow-up articles from later expos, such as from an informal hands-on demo at Macworld in July, reported that significant improvements to the game's visuals were being made. But with only a handful of months left before its intended release date of October 2001, the Myth 3 team were racing to meet their deadline. It now seemed certain that the Wolf Age's multiplayer would be utilising the GameSpy arcade service rather than Bungie.net. Yet in interviews, Campbell and others were still sending mixed signals on other features, including the AI and online editions. This was soon followed by confirmation that Myth 3 would launch with no more than 5 netgame maps, which seemed so paltry to fans that many assumed it was a misprint. Andrew Meggs had earlier claimed that the figure was merely an attempt to under-promise and over-deliver, and that the team had every intent of including extra multiplayer maps. Richard Cowgill would partially concur, later stating that the team themselves agreed 5 maps was not enough, but had simply not had the time to make any more. Some sort of organisational shift also occurred around this time, with Myth 3's Mac port transferred to Macsoft, albeit still programmed by Bill Heinemann. But the most significant event happening behind the scenes occurred around a month after the Macworld showing, as the troubles plaguing MumboJumbo's publisher came to a head. In August 2001, stories began to break reporting that Gathering of Developers had shut down. According to one contemporary press account, at the height of their financial problems, and apparently accelerated by the death of Doug Myers, GOD had been targeted by Take-Two for absorption into their New York headquarters, but board member Mike Wilson rebelled, taking much of the staff with him to form a new venture. Other stories, including a GameSpot interview with Wilson, disputed this account slightly, indicating that the move had been planned much earlier, and that Wilson had informed Take-Two of his intent on the first day of E3. Either way, for all intents and purposes, Gathering of Developers was effectively gone, and it appeared that MumboJumbo no longer had a publisher. Take-Two, however, soon clarified that Gathering of Developers would remain as a publishing label, and that those projects already in production would still be released under the same name. The drama quickly became the subject of discussion online, but Myth 3's development rolled on. And that same month, as their publisher was being gutted, MumboJumbo announced the Wolf Age was ready for beta testing, and solicited applications from the public to playtest the game. However, in his 2020 interview, Scott Campbell states that Myth 3 actually had very little playtesting outside the developers themselves. Campbell's recollection was that by then, the team was so familiar with their own levels that they struggled to force themselves to play legitimately, and had to guess how regular players would experience them, without knowing the level scripting and exploits. As the project entered September, now less than 2 months to release, a developer diary from Andrew Meggs indicated that several extra staff were being brought on to assist with the game, which is backed up by Richard Cowgill's account, in which he recalls intervention from MumboJumbo's founders in order to ensure it made its ship date. According to Meg's diary, fixing Myth 3's multiplayer code was a priority for the team's programmers. With the launch date looming closer, MumboJumbo seems to have finally abandoned some of the additional features they had still been discussing a month earlier, particularly those related to multiplayer, though Richard Cowgill would remark that, overall, very little of Myth 3's November 2000 design doc had been substantially changed. So so conservative were its goals, and having mostly been built around existing technology, that aside from a few cuts and adjustments, no major features had been downgraded or removed. It seemed at the time that even on a limited budget and an 11-month development cycle, the small and untested team had passed their crucible of fire, as Scott Campbell puts it, and were on the verge of going gold. But the team was soon forced to admit that two of their earlier promises to the community would not be met. First, Myth 3's Macintosh port was not able to keep pace with development, and as the Windows release approached, the Macsoft project began slipping. First projected to launch a few days after the PC version, then weeks, and eventually months. And MumboJumbo's other promise, that map-making tools would ship on the launch CD, looked as if it would also go unfulfilled. The team were having trouble merging the tools they were using into a single working package, and began considering backup plans, eventually resolving to ship the game without its editing tools, and deliver them as soon as possible after release. Still, even after facing these complications, on October 17th, 2001, Myth 3's Gold Master was submitted to Take-Two for duplication. The number of people who paid attention to this development was likely rather small, with Scott Campbell lamenting that with the lack of marketing support, awareness of Myth 3's upcoming launch was minimal. Campbell also suggested that the game's already low profile had been further buried by the September 11th terrorist attacks, which he recalled causing a general decline in industry sales around that period. On top of these challenges, Myth 3 would not be hitting the market unopposed, with at least 3 notable strategy titles releasing within the same launch window. Several commentators pointed out the Wolf Age was arriving within days of Firaxis East's Civilization 3, which had little in common with Myth's gameplay, but would, it was argued, undoubtedly draw attention away from rival strategy games. And 2 somewhat more direct challenges came in the form of Liquid Entertainment's Battle Realms, which was heavily marketed on its innovative gameplay and 3D graphics, and Stainless Steel's Empire Earth, a more traditional RTS title, but also utilising 3D and covering a far greater scope and scale than the Wolf Age. All the same, those who had pre-ordered began receiving their copies around the end of October, at roughly the same time Myth 3 appeared on retail shelves. Most print reviews were several weeks or even months away, but there was immediate feedback online, much of it, at least from regular commentators, highly negative. Bugs and stability issues were by far the most common complaint, with numerous reports that the game was incompatible with many operating systems, and that even those who were able to run the game frequently ran into crashes. The online mode was particularly criticised for this, subject, for example, to desynchronizing errors that would cause a single player to crash the entire match. On top of these issues, it was generally observed that the game as a whole was rather unpolished, most noticeably suffering from numerous visual glitches and lacking sound effects for many actions and ambience. And in a design sense, many commentators online considered Myth 3 to be poorly balanced in both single-player and online modes, with some stating they had been turned off immediately upon playing the first level. Furthermore, due to its rush to make the release date, marketing material and packaging for the Wolf Age was sometimes incorrect or out of date. Many launch copies falsely stated that the game still included easy-to-use editing tools, whilst others misstated which operating systems were supported. As a final indignity, Myth 3's installer triggered a warning from popular antivirus software Norton AV, prompting a small panic online that was eventually determined to be the result of a false positive. Even so, online review sites who covered the initial release were, at least on average, not remarkably harsh on Myth 3, usually awarding its scores in the 70 to 85% range, hardly proportional to the negativity it was receiving on discussion forums. IGN awarded the Wolf Age its Editor's Choice Award, and UGO's GamePen even nominated it for RTS of the Year, though it lost by a significant margin to Timegate's Cohen Immortal Sovereigns. Although most of these reviews acknowledged having heard complaints of its stability issues, they also posited that MumboJumbo had indeed made a title faithful to Bungie's games, perhaps, argued some, faithful to a fault. But the weight of anecdotal evidence that Myth 3's launch version was not up to standards, that it was, in the view of many, an alpha or beta release, was difficult to ignore. MumboJumbo staff have admitted that they were aware the Wolf Age had not been fully polished. Release copies of the game had shipped with an additional leaflet, acknowledging known technical issues and promising that a patch was forthcoming. Richard Cowgill revealed soon afterwards that they had recorded numerous unresolved bugs prior to submitting the Gold Master, and that they had deliberately tabled these bugs bugs precisely because they would be so easy to fix at a later date, instead prioritizing the most serious and time-consuming technical problems. Scott Campbell's recollection is similar, stating they had done their damnedest to make sure the game was as tight as possible before hitting their deadline, further clarifying that whilst they were aware of issues with the single-player mode, they had severely underestimated the extent of problems in the multiplayer code. The team had begun working on a patch almost immediately after the game went gold in October, as well as continuing their progress on the Vengeance tools. But that work was abruptly cut short in early November. Several MumboJumbo staff submitted unusual updates to forums or their developer diaries around November 5th, prompting a swirl of rumours on Myth fan sites. A number of news posters reported that they had been notified either that Take-Two had terminated their relationship with MumboJumbo, that MumboJumbo had been shut down, or some variation thereof. The Myth 3 team did not directly comment on these claims, instead responding to questions about the upcoming patch and map editor, leading many commentators to assume the rumours were merely an elaborate hoax. It was the more cynical or hysterical posters who turned out to be correct, however. Around 3 weeks after the game went gold, MumboJumbo's founders had informed the Myth 3 team that they would be closing their Irvine office. They were out of money and had not been able to negotiate any further work, and thus were no longer able to pay the team's salaries. The Myth 3 team had thus been formally terminated on November 2nd, 2001. Craig Matchett has referred to this as the team, quote, having the rug pulled from under us after killing ourselves trying to make a crazy deadline. Andrew Meggs broke the news to the public on November 16th, posting a thread entitled Some Ugly But Honest Truths on the Myth Village forums. Meggs stated that he would not blame anyone in particular for the shutdown, adding, call it everybody's fault if you're the angry sort, or nobody's fault if you're charitable. He further explained that the team had continued to work on a patch, which he hoped would be released through official channels, as well as finishing work on Vengeance, which was being done without support from MumboJumbo on several team members' own time. Meggs concluded by saying that the team were proud of their work on Myth 3, referencing the project's tight deadline, thanked the Myth community for their support, and asked for understanding as the team attempted to find new jobs. But if Meggs was hoping for sympathy from the community, he was to be disappointed. Although several posters expressed understanding and thanked the team for their work, others were furious at the announcement, feeling they had been cheated by MumboJumbo with a defective product. Several posters announced they would be complaining to consumer groups or starting a class action lawsuit. Others merely promised that they would never purchase a Take-Two product ever again. Some even celebrated the shutdown of the Irvine office, joking that Meggs and his cohorts deserved it for their shoddy programming and expressing the hope that their unemployment was to be permanent, whilst one poster used the opportunity to target Callender, Cowgill and Goodman and settle old scores within the map-making community. But at least one commentator directed their ire not at Meggs, nor MumboJumbo, nor even the license holder. It was Bungie, they argued, who bore ultimate responsibility for crashing the Myth franchise, for its fate had been sealed the very moment they had consented to giving up their rights to the series. MumboJumbo issued a formal statement on their website a few days later, reassuring fans that a patch was forthcoming and confirming that the Irvine office had been shut down, but claiming development of Myth 3 would continue at their Dallas office, where they hoped they would be joined by many of those formerly employed in Irvine. In reality, Scott Campbell states that most of the team went their separate ways. A few, such as Chris Jacobson, Joe Rydell and Richard Cowgill, returned with Scott Campbell and Bill Heineman to a revived Contraband software, though Heineman was at that point still working on Myth 3's Mac port. Andrew Meggs and Craig Matchett both moved to Troika Software, where they would work on the role-playing games Temple of Elemental Evil and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, whilst the remaining team members would scatter to various other studios, such as Gearbox Software and elsewhere. Despite the team's dissolution, several team members continued their work on the patch and map-making tools for some time after their termination. As work on the first patch wrapped up, Andrew Meggs and Richard Cowgill worked with the community to prepare for the release of Vengeance, recruiting beta testers and providing suggestions for how map makers could begin making their existing work compatible with the toolset. MumboJumbo uploaded Myth 3's 1.0.2 patch to its website on December 20th, as well as providing links to Vengeance, with the caveat that the latter was an unsupported release. Myth 3's Mac port, meanwhile, continued to slip further back, and failed to make its revised Christmas release. spite of Myth 3's negative feedback and the public ending of its developer, many members of the Myth community attempted to support it with additional content, and before the end of the year, a number of netgame maps were made available, including a port of those from the Fallen Lords multiplayer. The process was a struggle, however. Vengeance was an unsupported beta release, and widely regarded as buggy and sometimes frustrating to use, whilst interest in Myth 3 as a whole had been hampered by its poor reception and unstable multiplayer. As one fan site had joked in November, how can Myth 3 die when it never really lived? Myth 3's Macintosh port finally arrived in January 2002, by which point print reviews had begun to appear and MumboJumbo's internal problems were more widely known. Many of these reviews reported on Myth 3's notorious launch issues, and though some were positive, general sentiment was now aligned against it. Even the more positive reviews were in themselves controversial, not infrequently followed up by letters from readers accusing them of being too forgiving of the game. By now, there seemed little doubt that Take-Two had no interest in continuing to support the franchise. Specific sales figures were not provided to the Myth 3 team, but based on circumstantial evidence and public statements, it did poorly. Scott Campbell reports that the team were told nothing was selling, and in fact that Take-Two's numbers on the whole were dismal. Campbell himself stated, quote, "I can totally believe the game didn't sell anything," unquote, and vividly recalls visiting an electronics boutique store shortly after release, only to be greeted by the sad sight of a pile of Myth 3 copies stuffed into a bargain bin. Although formally speaking, the final update posted by MumboJumbo was the 1.02 patch, Andrew Meggs and others were still invested in supporting Myth 3, and the Myth community had no wish to see Take-Two let the series as a whole die out. Several prominent figures in the Myth community, aided by Meggs, Bill Heineman, Mark Doctorman and others, began negotiating with Take-Two over access to Myth 3's source code. This would eventually lead to the formation of the Myth Developers Group in early 2002, which struck an unusual bargain with the license holder. Take-Two would provide this group the source code and original assets for all 3 Myth games, permitting them to continue supporting the titles with unofficial patches and community-run servers. But in return, this work would be the legal property of the publisher, who had full rights to make use of it in the future if they so wished. Myth developers initially included a mix of former MumboJumbo staff, such as Andrew Meggs and Richard Cowgill, alongside members of the Myth map-making community, though these founding members would retire and be replaced over the course of the following year. Myth 3 therefore continued receiving unofficial updates throughout 2002 and 2003, both patches and additions to the tools required for map making. But Myth developers were riven by internal conflicts, both personal feuds and philosophical differences regarding where their efforts should be directed, with individual members sequestering themselves into rival factions that favoured either prioritising Myth 3 or focusing their efforts on the more popular Soulblighter engine, eventually culminating in the group's breakup in 2004. The Wolf Age branch of Myth developers formed Flying Flip Studios, who continued working on unofficial patches and released their own version of Vengeance, dubbed Ballistic, the same year, before formally disbanding in 2007. But for Myth 3, it was all far too late. The game's disastrous launch, stillborn multiplayer, and ongoing problems had meant that interest in the Wolf Age, among both fans and the map-making community, was limited. Although a few more maps and plugins were produced, what remained of the Myth community quickly rallied back around Myth 2, and as the Myth developers and later project Magma Group began releasing updates to Soulblighter, Bungie's games retrenched themselves as the standard bearer of the franchise. During Myth 3's development, Scott Campbell and his team had spoken of their interest in making a 4th Myth game, saying that they already had several ideas for where to take the franchise, but that this would depend on the success of the Wolf Age. Community-led attempts at continuing the Myth franchise apparently began as early as the final stages of Myth 3's development, and would be revived several times in the years following its release, though none were successful. Some former Bungie staff also made moves towards creating spiritual successors to Myth, such as Marcus Lehto's Disintegration, but these were either cancelled or changed direction early in development. Similarly, in 2017, Paul Callender's Dark Quarry Games released a Myth-inspired RTS ARPG entitled Deadhold on Steam Early Access, though development on the project was halted in 2018. Some sources with knowledge of the situation have also claimed that there was an earnest attempt to convince Take-Two to consent to a re-release of the Myth games, involving Myth community members and Night Dive Studios, but that this too was ultimately unsuccessful. The most recent attempt to revisit Myth 3 specifically was a Myth 2 conversion created by the modding group Knights of the Golden Circle. This add-on attempted to remake the Wolf Age in the updated Soulblighter engine, utilising a mix of assets from the original game alongside existing fan-made models, textures and special effects, and a beta version was released to the community in 2016. But with the discontinuation of all attempts to revive the franchise, and no indication that Take-Two is interested in pursuing future titles, as of writing, 2001's The Wolf Age remains the final official chapter in the history of the Myth series. Craig Goodman, who passed away of cancer in 2019, had once spoken wistfully of Myth 3, noting that even with its tight constraints, it had tried to push the envelope technologically, as well as provide some new functionality for the map-making community. Goodman had ruminated on porting some of his old work, such as World War II Titans, to the Myth 3 engine, taking advantage of its innovations. And for a brief period, there were those in the map-making scene who dreamed that Myth 3 could still provide a fresh and exciting platform for the modding community. Considering the difficult circumstances under which it was developed, and the attempts made by both MumboJumbo Irvine and the Myth community to salvage the title, it's only fair that we give Myth 3 at least one more chance to enjoy the spotlight. So let's head one last time into the breach, and experience the final game in the Myth franchise. When it first released, Myth 3 featured the same functionality as the previous games in the series, an offline single-player campaign and an online multiplayer mode. The latter initially featured 5 net maps that could be played in various game modes, such as Body Count, Assassin, Flag Rally, Hunting, Stampede and so on, plus a co-op option for playing the single-player levels, but the service and servers for Myth 3's online options are no longer available, neither GameSpy nor the replacement fan-made ones. Since this channel focuses on single-player games, and considering that Myth 3's multiplayer is effectively dead and very much buried as of writing, we won't waste time explaining the details of the online options, and instead get straight into the single-player. The solo campaign follows the same general structure as Myth 1 and 2, a tutorial and then 25 distinct missions, with victory in one opening up progression to the next, interspersed with a narrative mission briefing and the occasional cutscene. Unlike the first 2 games though, there are no secret levels. One, the defense of MumboJumbo Land, was intended to take place after the opening mission, but cannot be played in the final game unless re-enabled with an add-on. In each of the solo levels, the player controls the forces of the light, and must prevail against the enemy using only the troops they have available to them. There's no unit production, base building, or resource gathering involved in Myth 3, though as they progress through the level they may be granted reinforcements at various points. In effect, the player is saddled with a mix of pre-selected troops, and expected to use them as best they can to complete their objective. In-game, controls are almost the same as the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter. The mouse can be used to select units and tell them to move or attack, whilst they can use keyboard hotkeys to rotate or zoom the camera, assign units to groups, activate special abilities, turn the map on and off, or arrange selected units into formations. Formations are important due to the fact that Myth 3 dissuades clumping, or letting units too close to each other, meaning if a formation is too tight, units can block each other from moving or obstruct their line of sight. But formations are also important to minimise ranged or area of effect damage, which can come from either the enemy or the player's own units. Thus, a loose line of archers, facing the enemy head-on for example, is helpful because it maximises their damage output against incoming foes, whilst reducing the chance they'll take damage themselves, and making it easier for melee units to move between them when necessary. One difference with Soulblighter, however, is that units can no longer be rotated with the right mouse button, and the game has instead reverted to something akin to the gesture flick system from the original release of the Fallen Lords. The player can also save the game whenever they wish during a mission, bring up a collection of hints and tips, and can control the speed of the game, either reducing it to half speed or increasing it by a factor of up to 16 times the normal, but in a break with tradition cannot pause and give orders. The broad objectives for each mission vary a fair bit, but match those of the original games. Some require advancing through a level to reach an exit boundary, others to hunt down and kill specific targets, and some to defend the starting positions against several waves of enemies. Many levels have more specific mechanics, however, with several missions involving a stealth element, one pitting them against a respawning enemy whose power source must be destroyed, a few others including some basic puzzles, and a couple revolving around the ability to turn certain enemies to the player's side. Regardless of what happens on each map, or how the player completes their objective, none of the missions influence each other in any way. Even the veterancy system, which in previous titles let units who survived one level progress to the next with improved stats, is only activated in patched versions of Myth 3. The only element that can be described as persistent is the mission statistics screen at the end of each level, which players can use to track their score if they so wish. As always, players are greatly outnumbered by the enemy in each mission, so it's important they minimise their casualties in each encounter, making the most effective use of the different unit types under their control. The broad categories into which these units fall are the same as Myth 1 and 2. General melee units of varying speeds and stats, conventional ranged units, grenadier or bombardier type units that are powerful but risky and unpredictable, and hero units. For close combat, for example, we see the reappearance of shield-bearing warriors, fast-moving berserkers, and the dual-wielding Heron Guards, who have a limited supply of healing routes. Archers are another staple unit returning from previous titles, as are the fireball-throwing warlocks and the grenade-tossing dwarfs. But many levels of Myth 3 feature more specialised variants of these, such as mid-range spear chuckers in the opening missions, dwarven warriors and flame-throwing smiths in later chapters, and a few other surprises. The major deviation from previous games is an increased emphasis on unique hero units and their abilities, whose presence now bolsters the fighting skills of nearby allies. Some return from Myth 1 and 2, like the Avatara, who can annihilate whole columns of troops with their stock of dispersal dreams, or Myrddred, who freezes his opponent in place with a draining spell. Others are new to the series, such as the barbarian princess Ravana, a skilled fighter with a deadly spinning attack, or the hero Connaught, a particularly fearsome combatant who frequently gains unique abilities depending on the level, an artifact that lets him banish foes to another dimension in one mission, and a mighty warhammer that turns iron and stone to slag in another. Similarly, many of the opponents the player will be facing are iconic foes from earlier Myth games, such as the lumbering axe-wielding Thrall, the floating soulless javelin men, the savage Mircridians and their giant explosive-flinging cousins, and the exploding wights.
Casualty.
Some of these returning enemies have new variants. The massive Trow from previous titles are at the height of their power in Myth 3, clad head to toe in thick iron armour and leading hordes of resilient ogre slave soldiers, whilst the Gold Scavengers are aided by larger and meaner versions, as well as a priest caste who can summon whirlwinds of battlefield debris. Other enemies are technically new, but analogous to opposing units from Myth 1, like the fast-moving Forgotten and swarms of giant spiders. Again, some enemies are completely new to the franchise, like the Servants of the Spider Cult, who can paralyse the player's units with their poisonous concoctions. And of course the battlefields of this age are also stalked by champions of darkness with their own terrible powers. As is typical of the series, each mission of the Wolf Age is carefully scripted to challenge the player's mastery of their units by exploiting every advantage held over their foes. On occasion, these challenges are specific to each mission. The game might pull the rug out from under the player by suddenly disabling a special ability they'd been relying on, or introduce a unit that can turn the player's own forces against them. And Myth 3's campaign is, on average, more difficult than prior titles, and becomes increasingly demanding of the player's ability to micromanage their units. Whereas at first they might be able to scrape through missions with some basic tactics and good use of formations, even on the default difficulty they'll come to a point where they need to be extremely conscious of specific details of both friendly and hostile units' stats and abilities, from the precise speed of each unit relative to each other, to which types of damage can cause flinching, to how many attacks a unit can get off at varying distances. On a per-mission basis, they also have to keep in mind factors like enemy patrol routes, or what damage and casualty thresholds trigger changes in their foes' behaviour. All that said, for the most part in Myth 3, the player's opposition will be making use of tactics that will be very familiar to Myth veterans. With their numerical superiority, the Dark Legions will often try to trap or corral the player's forces into unenviable positions. Undead units are frequently stationed underwater, allowing them to spring ambushes from marshes and rivers. Soulless can float over any sort of terrain type, letting them cross deep water or mountains to launch surprise attacks or retreat from melee. Spiders can hide in the shadows or cling to walls and ceilings, and will often emerge from nearby crevices, or descend from above when the player least expects it. And packs of cowardly ghouls will, as always, taunt units from a safe distance, goading them into breaking formation and isolating them from allies before the ghouls charge in and carve them to pieces. The player must therefore be alert to all possible dangers, balancing caution and aggression to make the most of the forces available to them. Dwarves can destroy whole battalions of thrall, so long as they stay at a safe distance from their own explosive molotovs, but will quickly be overtaken by a handful of ogres. Warlocks can annihilate whole swarms of foes with their fireballs, but only if they can reach them before they're skewered by javelins or arrows. Warriors make for highly effective guardians to archers if menaced by ghouls, until their foes start tossing explosive pus packets. And no formation can maintain cohesion in the face of an armoured trow, a wight, or a magic whirlwind in their midst. In some cases, the player must be mobile, advancing their forces fast enough to outrun the enemy without letting them be destroyed piecemeal along the way. Other times, they must be sturdy and unyielding, not allowing a single foe to pass their lines. And sometimes they must be everything at once, forming a phalanx against an enemy charge one moment, retreating to pour fire and steel into a wall of thrall the next, and scattering like prey when the earth beneath them rumbles with the force of foul sorcery. As they juggle these responsibilities and adapt to constantly changing circumstances, they'll inevitably make errors. A ghoul dashes in amongst their archers. A wight wanders too close to their lines. An axe or cleaver slips past their fighters' defences one too many times. Their forces will begin to buckle and sag as they bleed from 1,000 tiny cuts, their healing roots exhausted, their artifacts drained, and their satchel charges expended. It's only now that the enemy mobilises for a final hammer blow, a massed assault on the player's surviving men meant to annihilate them once and for all, and that only the most skilled commanders can hope to endure. I mentioned in the previous videos that even all the way back in 1997, there was a portion of the RTS audience for whom the Myth series never really clicked. PC Gamer UK, for example, consistently gave the Myth series significantly lower scores than their American peers, as to a lesser extent did PC Zone and a number of European gaming magazines, especially in Germany. What was traditionally an 8 or 9 out of 10 game in American magazines was more of a steady 6 or 7 in some regions. I don't think there was anything untoward going on here. Granted, CGW's Myth 2 review was, by the account of its original author, edited to sound more positive than the writer's actual impressions, but if you're familiar with the behind the scenes of games journalism, this is hardly an outlier. Moreover, leading publications from some regions gave substantially higher scores than the US magazines, so it's not merely US reviewers being more sycophantic or anything like that. It's probably simply the fact that Myth's much vaunted multi-metric tactics were actually a negative for a good number of the audience. The most common factors that came in for criticism were the camera, the controls, and the difficulty level, with the three issues usually intertwined. Some players and reviewers consistently took issues with the rotatable 3D camera, others found that controlling units, from their behaviour to their positioning, was more of a hassle than in traditional RTS, and others, often as a consequence of the aforementioned complaints, concluded that the game was just too frustrating overall, too difficult, and too easily swung by random chance. Bungie themselves responded to this feedback almost immediately, nerfing the lower difficulty levels in the Fallen Lords with its first patch, and in Myth 2 adjusting the controls, collision detection, and unit behaviour to be significantly more forgiving. Dwarves were more reliable, archers more accurate, units able to clump up and pass through gaps more easily, and in a nutshell, making a commander's life a little easier. Something I personally wasn't aware of when I played Myth 3 back in 2001 was that MumboJumbo had consciously reversed some of these changes in their game. Apparently they wanted the gameplay to feel closer to the Fallen Lords rather than Soulblighter, despite being based on the latter's engine. Why, I don't know. Maybe they felt Soulblighter had lost the sense of holding out against overwhelming odds, the centrality of good positioning, the chaotic, ever-changing circumstances of battle or such. Or maybe it was simply that they knew the only people buying Myth 3 would be long-time fans, who had already mastered the first two games and perhaps several community campaigns too. Pre-release interviews indicate that Myth 3 was supposed to be easier to get into for beginners, but that could just have been marketing fluff that they never really thought would be a big factor. And if the intent was to make the game more difficult and more chaotic, then they succeeded, because it's not hard to find first impressions of Myth 3 that mention playing the demo or final game and quitting right after the first couple of missions. Level 1, the Defense of Yrzgrad, involves protecting a group of townspeople from a horde of Mircridia, whilst the Nest has the player sneak a small force into the Mircridia's cavernous home and clean out its heart. The complaints, when communicated directly, seem to have been that players didn't really understand what they were doing and were overwhelmed. One factor might be that the game's tutorial didn't appear until after starting a new game, which automatically launched the Defense of Yrzgrad, but I think the design itself is the major sticking point. An unforgiving opening isn't alien to the Myth series. Although Myth 2 had a relatively gentle first mission, the Fallen Lord's iconic Crow's Bridge, one of the missions chosen for their demo release, was quite a challenge for first-timers, and the second, Traitor's Grave, was arguably very trial and error oriented. But I think there are some significant divergences between Crow's Bridge and the Defense of Yrzgrad that somewhat typify issues players had with the Wolf Age. Though Crow's Bridge pit the player against a horde of Thrall, numerous Soulless, and very tricky goals, it also gave them all the tools they needed to hard counter these enemies. Though they might get annihilated on the first try, or 3, they'd learn quite quickly that given enough space, a single dwarf could shred the slow-moving Thrall with minimal danger to themselves, and the only real threats were the Ghouls, who, if trapped by the warriors, were barely a nuisance, and the Soulless, who were dangerous but could still be flanked and baited. And though the mission did have a fail condition in losing the town's centre, a remnant of Myth's Alpha, where holding the town itself was the mission objective, by moving straight for the bridge, the player could easily give themselves plenty of space to draw the enemy out and control their movements. Yrzgrad is a very different beast, however. Firstly, the player's movements are limited by the fact they have a large group of non-combatants to protect, which in itself burdens them with more units to keep track of. Secondly, the enemy consists of multiple groups coming in from several different directions, making it considerably more difficult to bait or herd them. Thirdly, none of the units granted to the player in the first mission are really a hard counter to the Mircridia. The brownish Mircridian hunters are no particular danger, but the main threat are the regular beasts, who are somewhat fast-moving, certainly faster than the town people and skirmishers, and roughly equal in combat to the player's berserks. Connaught is obviously their better, but he's also quickly overwhelmed if fighting more than a couple at once. And the player's other main unit type, the Hearthguard, are merely mid-range attackers with fairly average damage output against standard Mircridians. So there's a completely different dynamic here to Crow's Bridge, where warriors, archers, and a dwarf were squaring off against a handful of weak but fast-moving Ghouls, some Soulless, and then the bulk of the enemy forces, which were sluggish Thrall, all on a large map that could easily be turned to the player's advantage. With so many factors to consider and limitations on their tactical positioning, a new player thus has a lot to pick up in Myth 3's first level, and even when they do adjust, their options are not as good as in the opening of the Fallen Lords, which teaches them a pretty solid dynamic they can apply to many of the subsequent levels. And once they get into combat, they'll run into another of Myth 3's issues, which is that the basic act of getting into combat turns into a mess. With such a small space to maneuver, Javelin Men's line of sight gets obscured. Pillars and civilians will block Connaught and the Berserks, and on top of all that, units in Myth 3 are appallingly bad at prioritizing targets, frequently running past multiple enemies and taking hits in the process to try and get at a foe much further away. Watching replays of group versus group melee combat in Myth 3 does not give the best impression of their AI, and nor should it, because these basic issues with target selection and movement will crop up plenty of times throughout the campaign, leading to plenty of examples of alternatingly passive and omnicidal ranged units, or troop maneuvers that would make a nursery seem like a military academy in comparison. And to keep this in historical context, remember that on release, people were playing a version of the game with serious bugs, like warriors not being able to use their shields. On weak or mighty difficulty at least, the player could still muddle through the first level, but they probably wouldn't feel a huge amount of accomplishment from it. On legendary, the game's awkward balancing is at its most obvious. Rather than maximising the strengths of their various units, they'll probably be using some ridiculous meta strategy like aggroing the entire map with Connaught, or getting Mircridia stuck on scenery. That's the only strategy I ever found to work on that difficulty, and the same seems to be true of all the other legendary runs I've seen of the game. From the player's perspective, it's an achievement, but one that comes about through essentially breaking the game's AI rather than tactical genius. Now, as I mentioned in the other videos, this has always been a problem to varying extents of Myth's legendary difficulty. There are some missions in both the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter that are only winnable on the hardest difficulty with comical displays of cheesing and exploits, but nowhere to the degree of Myth 3, where this reliance on metagaming has spilled out of legendary and into the regular default difficulty. Several missions, in particular the notorious Bonds of the Ogre, appear to have been consciously designed around exploits, like kiting enemies in circles or chain staggering them so they can barely move an inch before dying. I was so baffled by the balancing in some levels that I wondered if their difficulty had been altered by changes made in the patches. Trow, for example, were modified significantly after the 1.0 release because their attacks were so unreliable. But checking both Day 1 or Month 1 comments on fan sites and playing the unpatched release of the game confirms that the complaints people make about these levels today are pretty much the same as those made at launch. And due to scripted events, some missions are impossible to achieve with no casualties, a popular but unofficial requirement of fan runs of the Myth series. A limitation that existed in the first game, granted, but it's surprising no damage or no casualty runs weren't accommodated in a game where the majority of the level designers came from the community. It may be that they didn't have time to adjust level scripting for this purpose, or equally likely, it may be due to, per Scott Campbell's claim, the fact Myth 3's campaign wasn't properly playtested outside MumboJumbo. Distinguishing between legitimate strategies and metagaming was probably quite a challenge for a team that had been running circles around their own AI scripting for months before release. Players are left with a more difficult, more chaotic, and frankly slightly more janky experience than previous games, which is made worse by a particularly odd departure from the gameplay of Myth 1 and 2. Now, the Myth series was always a real-time experience. The emphasis was on making tactical decisions mostly on the fly, and often under pressure, but it did allow the player to open the menu and pause the action and give commands, slightly awkwardly, before resuming the action. Myth 3 disabled the ability to give orders from the pause screen, so players can only go so far as to reduce the speed by half and hope that's enough to give them some breathing room. But for many missions, it really isn't. Levels like the Gates of Mirgard or Siege of Lankafin require keeping tabs on simultaneous clashes across the battlefield, often involving some heavy microing at the same time. The closest comparison would be something like Across the Guild from Myth 1, or in Myth 2, the Library, Redemption, and the Wall, but those levels didn't require anywhere near the same amount of micromanagement. With speed controls and pausing the game, I found Redemption and the Wall on Legendary less stressful than Gates of Mirgard on default difficulty in Myth 3. There's an argument to be made for this change, that it forces the player to make better use of hotkeys and group commands, and makes it more difficult to perform exploits like leading projectile attacks. Some older reviews complained that Myth's gameplay was too start and stop, because you were always pausing or slowing down to give orders. In fact, some fan contests for the older games had house rules that said legendary runs had to be done in multiplayer, because it disabled speed controls. But what this change means in the Wolf Age is that issues with the camera, controls, and AI can no longer be mitigated by pausing the game and giving orders manually, and Myth 3's mission design and other adjustments make these issues even worse. Since there's no pressure valve for frustrations with your troops not doing what they're supposed to, or just feeling overwhelmed by too much happening at once, there's a good chance that all the effort MumboJumbo put into making Myth 3 like its predecessors has gone to waste, because players can feel like they're just playing a jankier version of the originals with worse AI, even when a lot of the mistakes being made are actually present in the old titles. But the second big complaint reviewers had about Myth 3 was precisely that it was trying to be like Bungie's games. Apart from camera and control problems, some reviewers had always been harsh on Myth's entry-level tactical gameplay, which endeavoured to be more sophisticated than the point-and-click tactics of C&C clones, but not so granular as a war game or squad-level milsim. This never sat right with some reviewers, who argued, from the Fallen Lords to the Wolf Age, that the focus on weather, landscape, and formations was not enough to make up for cutting out the strategic elements of traditional RTS. In a retrospective interview with CVG, Creative Assembly director Mike Simpson suggested that the reason Shogun Total War had succeeded was due to the question of scope. Simpson argued that when Shogun, or Taisho, entered development, rival RTS developers, even those making the switch to 3D, were increasingly narrowing or limiting their ambitions, working with smaller groups of units, whereas Shogun went in completely the opposite direction. And there's certainly plenty of evidence to support this from gaming magazines and forums of the day, who praised RTS titles that tried to do something more ambitious than the C&C formula. But as attractive as this narrative is, plucky and ambitious titles succeeding over the entrenched industry dinosaurs, it's important to remember that the big RTS sellers of the late 90s and early 2000s were Command & Conquer, StarCraft, and Age of Empires, plus a few clones. Whether this was due to brand inertia or the traditional RTS model just holding more mainstream appeal, who can say? But established franchises found themselves torn between a widespread critical consensus that they needed to innovate, and the reality that in the early 2000s, conventional RTS titles were still selling several million copies within months of release. The Myth series, for its part, had never matched the sales of the big names in RTS. Not quite niche, but referred to in some magazines as a sleeper hit rather than a record-breaking success. I've not seen any evidence MumboJumbo ever considered changing things too drastically in Myth 3. Several interviews, and Scott Campbell himself, insist that they were saving that for a potential Myth 4. But Richard Cowgill has suggested that, at the very least, Myth needed to be a faster-paced game with more evolutionary changes, and that essentially making Myth 2 with a new graphical engine was not enough. Cowgill felt that mimicking the gameplay of the previous titles boxed the team in, restricting them from adding new mechanics, whilst both he and Craig Goodman recalled that trying to balance the Wolf Age around Bungie's classics was also, counterintuitively, a major demand on their available development time. Of course, for MumboJumbo there was really no other option. I'm not sure whether Scott Campbell's original pitch for Myth 3 was significantly different in gameplay to the final product. I get the impression the scale and scope would have been larger, but still using the standard mechanics, give or take a few level-specific gimmicks like artillery emplacements. Some previews mention enemies hiding in bushes, which sharp-eyed commanders could observe based on unusual movements. Maybe similar to flocks of birds being disturbed in battle realms, but the closest to this you get is enemies randomly spawning out of the ground near leafy spots, and even if this had made it in-game, I doubt it would have been used for anything more complicated than some scripted ambushes. In any case, it's not as if MumboJumbo had much choice in the matter. For an 11-month development cycle, at best, anything more ambitious than recreating Myth's gameplay in an upgraded engine was likely suicidal. And besides this, there's the fact that from the moment the franchise left Bungie's hands, whoever had to design Myth 3 was burdened with the responsibility of having something to prove. As illustrated by marketing and feedback to the project from late 2000 all the way to October 2001, MumboJumbo were clearly terrified by a potential backlash to any changes they made to the standard formula. Realistically, only one developer had the mandate to touch the holy precepts of the Myth series, and that was Bungie. MumboJumbo, at best, needed to, at the very least, establish their credentials with Myth 3 before making any attempt to revise or update Myth's gameplay. But if the basics of Myth 3's gameplay were, as Richard Cowgill stated, modelled on the Fallen Lords, then the broader picture of level design seems more akin to Myth 2. Much like Tuncer Deniz and the Soulblighter team, MumboJumbo were mostly trying to design scenarios within the existing confines of the Myth engine and their tools, pushing the limits of their scripting as far as it could go. And even Deniz's team initially experimented with features like cavalry and artillery, whereas MumboJumbo didn't have time to try anything particularly new. The poorly received Myth 2 Green Berets, which was released a few months before Myth 3, was actually more of a shake-up than the Wolf Age. MumboJumbo had neither time nor budget to attempt much beyond some new units and straining their brains to think of fresh challenges for the standard Myth experience. Thus, like Myth 2, there are, at least from the player's perspective, no major surprises when it comes to the sticky situations in which they find themselves. Looking at the November 2000 design doc, it does seem as if Scott Campbell's outlines for some of the levels were dialed back somewhat, not just in the obvious sense of certain scripted sequences or the general scale of the battles, but in the scope for player agency. In the design doc, several levels appear to involve giving the player more freedom to shape the battlefield to their liking, deciding when, where, and how to strike the enemy's forces, but also forcing them to be more aware of the evolving circumstances elsewhere on the map. In the final game, however, these missions are much more like traditional Myth levels, rather more linear and progression-based, with the player usually reacting to individual encounters instead of being concerned with strategic issues. This emphasis on, at times, almost corridor-like map design that funneled the player towards set-piece encounters was a long-standing feature of Myth single-player, which relied on intensive level scripting rather than an overall AI commander, hence complaints in contemporaneous reviews of the lack of skirmish modes or random map generators. It may be that Campbell overestimated the capabilities of the Soulblighter engine's scripting capabilities. One level sounds more like a set-piece battle from a Total War title than a real-time tactics game. Or it may be that the doc was just intentionally broad in its description of the scenario, since the details would be filled in by individual level designers. There are several cases throughout the game in which the pre-mission briefing, and sometimes the in-game hints, give a different impression of the level than what the player experiences, sometimes misleading them into rushing a level, for example, by incorrectly stating that the mission is under a time limit. And there are half-implemented mechanics, like keeping torches lit in the second level. I think it's fair to speculate that in some cases the level designers were trying to build them around scripting that was scrapped at the very last second, resulting in a mismatch between intent and final result. Whatever occurred behind the scenes, Myth 3's levels feature a fair amount of variety, but little that hasn't been tried in previous titles. There's a particular favoritism towards quasi-stealth missions, where the player has to avoid large groups of enemies and conserve their forces for a handful of unavoidable scripted fights. Also returning from previous games are missions ditching armies and focusing on a small band of heroes, with some simple puzzles thrown in, though I don't think these are as balanced around each hero's strengths and weaknesses as the first two games. There are the usual stand your ground missions, again not too different to Myth 1 or 2, and again occasionally exposing weaknesses in the friendly AI, and a fighting retreat that culminates in environmental destruction a la Gonan's Bridge. However, there are a few new scenarios that iterate on the established formula. Levels 15 and 16, Bonds of the Ogre and Rebellion, are somewhat notorious for both their difficulty and, as mentioned earlier, their reliance on metagaming and exploits. I'm certainly not going to defend the former, which is absolutely nightmarish in regular difficulty and even worse on Legendary, but the latter, Rebellion, actually has a certain appeal to it, with a relatively open map that encourages frequent repositioning and the use of ogre slaves as a sort of resource that must be seized, stockpiled, and expended by the player in order to survive. If Bonds of the Ogre was more about metagaming and working around the level scripting, Rebellion almost made you feel like you were thinking more strategically. Judging from impressions online, not a popular level by any means, but in a sea of mostly recycled scenarios, there's a certain inventiveness to it. Another element that quite a few players did give MumboJumbo credit for was, well, boss design. Myth has never really had bosses exactly, more like uber units like giants and heroes. In Myth 1, the Shades were almost sort of like a mini-puzzle due to the danger of their dispersal dreams, and I suppose the same could be said of Soulblighter's role in the Great Devoid. In the Wolf Age, players must use slightly more elaborate tactics against similar enemies. The Watcher's cataclysmic magic can be turned against his own summon. summons, whilst the leveler bombards the battlefield with vortexes to force your units to keep moving. Honestly, I'm not as fond of these boss battles as some other fans. The puzzle element feels a bit shallow and doesn't require you to rummage too thoroughly through your toolbox of tactics. I'd have been satisfied with the Final Wave plus Trowel model that the Fallen Lords popularised. Still, credit to MumboJumbo for trying something new and exciting. The first time you encounter these bosses is reminiscent of the last battle in Myth 1, except you actually have to react and adapt to the boss's attacks, rather than reload and keep your distance until a scripted event. In its totality, then, Myth 3 achieved its goal of recreating the core gameplay of Bungie's Myth games, tweaking some things here and there and putting a new spin on some well-worn scenarios from the originals. But even if we can respect the team for achieving this modest goal, or perhaps not so modest considering the pressures they were under, playing Myth 3 can be summarised as Myth, but a bit worse. Those levels closest to the feel of Myth 1 or 2, like the Pack Mage or Journey to Lancofen, are almost identical in both level design and basic gameplay mechanics, yet they are also less polished, not to mention coloured by frequent AI mishaps and frustrating controls. Contextually, when Myth 3 arrived in 2001, it was effectively a slightly frayed and imperfect counterfeit of a product that had launched 4 years prior. Not a bigger and better game, as was the usual expectation for RTS sequels, nor an ambitious reimagining, as a few franchises had begun moving towards at the time. The team did aver that they had some ambitious plans for a potential Myth 4, but, as we know, that never materialised. There was only one area in which MumboJumbo could proudly proclaim themselves to be setting a new standard for the series, rather than chasing past glories. The move to 3D, and some of the other technological additions to the Soulblighter engine, were heavily marketed in the lead up to Myth 3, as well as the features cited by several MumboJumbo staff as the achievements they're most proud of. This ostensible upgrade was not without controversy. Hardly a surprise considering how fondly many fans regarded the art direction established by Bungie. So, let's move on to the next chapter of the retrospective, and have a look at how the Wolf Age made strides, or, according to some, reversals, in the audio-visual elements that brought the world of Myth to living colour. You might recall that the importance of enhancing Myth's visual fidelity was established pretty much from the outset of the Wolf Age's development. Though the first two games utilised 3D battlefields, most in-game assets were 2D sprites, from the iconic pre-rendered unit models to the visual effects of magic and explosions. A few objects, most commonly buildings, did use 3D models, and Myth 2 featured additions like 3D fog, but Bungie still relied on 2D assets for the most part. MumboJumbo, or Contraband initially, decided to move on from this. Scott Campbell has credited programmer Andrew Meggs as having pushed for dropping the traditional 2D approach of Myth 1 and 2 in favour of a 3D renderer. As I've mentioned in a few other videos, what 3D graphics or 3D rendering meant was subject to many differing interpretations from players, developers, journalists, and marketing departments. The Fallen Lords, for example, was originally described as true 3D, until it wasn't. But by the 2000s, relying on sprites over real-time polygonal models was generally accepted to be proof that a game was, quote, not 3D. That left Myth 1 and 2 branded with the scarlet letter of 2D games. So the idea that moving to a fully 3D, or at least polygonal 3D approach might drum up interest in Myth 3 was not a ludicrous suggestion. Even though 2D games were still selling, there was an overwhelmingly strong perception among critics that 2D art looked behind the times, and most had no problems saying as such online or in print. Indeed, the year after Myth 3 3 launched, Tropico developer Phil Steinmeier penned an opinion piece in Computer Games magazine entitled "I Hate 3D". Steinmeier argued that 3D games were detrimental to the industry for a number of reasons, but in particular that polygonal graphics were still rather ugly, that free or rotatable cameras added nothing to most RTS, and most worryingly, that games being made in 3D cost roughly 3 times as much as 2D projects, and would contribute to pricing many studios and consumers right out of the industry. But his number one complaint was that developers also had no choice but to move to 3D, noting that criticism of Tropico's pre-rendered visuals as dated had forced his studio to, at the time, switch to polygonal 3D for their next title, even though, he argued, real-time 3D graphics wouldn't look as good as pre-rendered assets. Steinmeier also cited examples of other developers being strong-armed into abandoning 2D graphics, concluding that, quote, 3D is the future, and the future is depressing. Back in November 2001, Craig Goodman had also innocently mused as to whether turning Myth 3 into a 3D game had actually been worth the trouble, but admitted the move may well have been the only thing MumboJumbo could really market the game on. Even so, those who had joined the Myth 3 team all the way back in autumn 2000 would not see the results of this switch for some time, since when work on Myth 3 first commenced, level designers were still using placeholder graphics or Myth 2 assets. They did, however, have a taste of what Myth in 3D might look like thanks to an early tech demo, a scene of trees being pushed apart by an explosion, bending and swaying in the aftermath, which Richard Cowgill recalls the team recognizing as the perfect model for how Myth 3 should depict series staples like dwarf Molotovs and explosive whites. But MumboJumbo's artists had started producing 3D models of these classic units long before physics and deformation were fully integrated into the engine, and when fans first got a glimpse of these, reception was not unanimously positive. A long-running debate that began in early 2001 and continued up to release involved the merits of the original pre-rendered 2D units compared to MumboJumbo's real-time polygonal models. A back and forth between two fans, Archer of Thrall and Patroclus, involved a comparative study of units shared between the two games, with one faction agreeing with Andrew Meggs that the increased level of detail and, eventually, Tiki-based animations made the switch to 3D worthwhile, whereas their opponents felt that polygonal models looked noticeably worse than the pre-rendered sprites of the originals. It was only later in the Wolf Age's marketing that fans were able to see all of Myth 3's innovations working together, from polygonal 3D models to new physics and deformation effects, combined with a new lighting engine. But the debate over 2D versus 3D never quite went away, with some fans insistent that Myth 3 was uglier or, at best, more technologically advanced but less artistically consistent than Bungie's games. In terms of the technology at play, it's worth keeping in mind that at release there was likely far greater variance in the visuals enjoyed by Myth 3 players than among those who bought the Fallen Lords or Soulblighter. Myth 1, released in 1997, could run in software mode, with improvements for those with 3D acceleration cards, and targeted machines of around 16 megabytes memory and roughly 200 MHz processors, whilst a year later Myth 2 had similar requirements, aside from needing more RAM. Again, the second game had some additional features those with better hardware could take advantage of, but most players would have seen a very similar rendition of the Myth world regardless of their specs. The Wolf Age, however, was asking for a minimum of a 400 MHz processor. Most magazines recommended at least 600 or above, along with 96 MB of memory and a 3D card. More importantly, the quality of Myth 3's graphics varied quite a bit depending on the settings, with resolutions going from 640 by 480 all the way up to 1600 by 1200, multiple levels of model and texture quality, enabling or disabling various shadows and lighting effects, and so on. Obviously, the average computer specs had improved since 1997, but there was still a lot of Myth fans playing on older machines, and even those who met the minimum requirements would have been playing at lower resolutions with lesser quality models and missing many special effects. I recall from personal experience experience that when I bought Myth 3 on release, my computer wasn't great, and I remember my frame rate absolutely tanking every time a Molotov detonated. So when evaluating Myth 1 and 2 versus Myth 3's unit models, for example, quite a few players were probably seeing heavily optimized low-quality polygonal models, minus any impressive lighting or the like. But that's not an issue we have looking at Myth 3 today, of course. So how do Bungie and MumboJumbo's games compare in a best-case scenario? Well, let's be fair, for an RTS coming out in autumn or winter 2001, with a fair number of units on screen at once, the Wolf Age is definitely no ugly duckling. The most impressive achievement to me is definitely the lighting and shadow effects, which are a major evolutionary jump for the Soulblighter engine. Seeing small fireballs and Molotovs light up the ground, for example, or larger explosions setting the shadows to dance in the glow of their eruptions. It is occasionally obvious that the shadows are actually not of the fully rendered models themselves, but the overall effect is still impressive. These effects look cool enough on the regular maps, but you really see them at their best in the interior locations. Mazarin's Crypt in particular was a hell of a tech demo for these, with its interplay of pitch black rooms, interactive braziers, and dynamically lit spirit creatures roaming the halls. Environments in general are pretty detailed, with high quality terrain and water effects, although in interior locations it seems to me that there are actually fewer props than in Myth 2's The Barren level, probably because they'd all have to be 3D models, maybe because the maps in Myth 3 seem bigger, or maybe just because MumboJumbo didn't have time to fill some of these rooms out. They did of course have time to overhaul all of Soulblighter's VFX, so fire, explosions, gas, smoke, magic fireballs and all the rest are all redone as 3D particle effects. Some of these look amazing, like the Gold Priest's Whirlwind or the Leveler's Vortex Dream, which make great use of the physics. And I'm sure a lot of people who played Myth 3 back in the day remember the first time they fought the Watcher, whose Molten attack is a great example of the deformable terrain, something that was implemented in a different way in the Fallen Lords, but scaled back a bit in Soulblighter. Still, I'm not sure the new effects for classic attacks, like the Dwarf Molotov or White Death, are necessarily better than the originals. I think a lot of people were quite attached to these iconic explosions. In fact, the closer you focus on the new effects, the louder the criticisms from some fans. Though the game's new physics were a key talking point in the marketing, grass swaying in the wind, tree trunks wrenched to and fro by explosive force, these can be prone to distracting quirks. The grass can glitch out, trees can often move in a jerky and unnatural way, but an even bigger issue was the game falling short on the violence. One of the most important and memorable elements of the first two games was their gore, persistent blood and corpses, dismembered limbs flying about, and all the rest. Perhaps more so in the first game, which used larger sprites and more exaggerated physics for bouncing body parts. A very common complaint of Myth 3 at release was that it simply wasn't as bloody as the previous games, not helped by the fact that promises to journalists, perhaps misinterpreted, of blood flowing downhill or pooling in crevices were not upheld. MumboJumbo did try to address this iron deficiency in the first patch, but it's still something you see the game criticised for. Obviously, this is all a matter of degree. Depending on how you play Gates of Mirgard, for example, the central area can quickly turn into total carnage. Still, I think Myth 3 does make a few small missteps that add up to a less satisfying display of violence than Bungie's games. One issue is the lack of tweaking or polish to certain effects. For one, it's nice that whole corpses can now be affected by physics, or can be torn in half rather than instantly breaking into multiple body parts, but these can look a bit silly in the final game. This is before ragdoll physics was widespread in FPS or third-person games, let alone RTS. But even at the time, seeing 3D corpses flying about with a severe case of rigor mortis can seem a bit odd. Typically, the way to deal with this at the time was to jib them, or give them animations for flying through the air. In the same vein, it's cool that Trow have special death animations, but seeing giant pieces of armor plop straight onto the floor and clip through each other kind kind of ruins the effect. It's the sort of minor issue I'm sure the artists would have tweaked if they'd had the time for it. Craig Goodman apologised for a few of the visual effects he'd handled, for example, admitting that some were placeholders he simply hadn't had time to revise before release. But if there's one aspect of Myth 3's visuals pretty much everyone at MumboJumbo probably agreed needed more time and money, it's the cutscenes. Off the top of my head, virtually everyone on the Myth 3 team who spoke candidly in public, and the couple who spoke to me directly for this video, immediately brought these up as the most obvious victim of the small budget and short production cycle. As mentioned earlier, these were meant to play an important part in the storytelling, but circumstances led to barely a handful actually being done, either in-game or in-engine, and the rest cut or outsourced to third parties. I won't speculate as to who was responsible for what. Even if I did know, it would probably be unfair to highlight anyone's work, since everybody involved seems to agree they were made in difficult circumstances. We can, though, point out the final result sometimes looks either cheap, inconsistent, or both at once. The photoshopped 3D images probably stick out the most. I noticed a lot of criticism of these in reviews, and I think I vaguely remember being surprised at how bad they looked back at release. The sketches, however, are also problematic, because they seem to have been done in at least 3, possibly 4 different styles. I'm assuming from the same number of artists. There's a mostly consistent style between the pre-mission briefings and the victory or defeat screens, though I'm fairly certain they're by at least 2 different artists, and even here some slightly out of place pictures slip in. But the interstitial screens, which replaced several major cutscenes and I think were where most of the outsourced work went, are much more often and obviously a mix of clashing styles. The line work and colouring can vary quite a bit, which is distracting in itself, and leads to some odd situations like certain characters appearing to completely change ethnicity between cutscenes. If MumboJumbo had known they would have to rely exclusively on static 2D art from the start of development, they probably could have worked around this and even integrated it into the story, different sketches being done by different characters, for example. Unfortunately, it seems to have been something they'd done their best to adjust to, but as Scott Campbell had apparently predicted even before release, not managed to prevent from reflecting badly on the final game. What's particularly odd from the player's perspective is the distribution of animated cutscenes versus static versions. The former are often used where they're least necessary, like a bunch of characters standing around talking, whereas the latter are utilised for action scenes the player wants to see in motion, like battles. Again, the reasons for this have already been covered, and in fairness, considering the budget, it's possible the opposite scenario would have been even more embarrassing, since those renders utilising the original character models seem to have been most heavily criticised. But since we're talking about models and animations, it's worth finally getting round to comparing MumboJumbo's polygonal versions to Bungie's 2D originals. One nice feature is that, unlike Myth 1 or 2, there's variety to units of the same type. Different weapons, some alternative outfits, maybe head models, and some other differences depending on the troop type. Some of the units, like the warriors, sport a reflective armor effect, others flapping cloaks or hair whipping back and forth as they move. And don't forget, this was all the way back in 2001. Zooming in just a little bit can bring out an amazing amount of detail on these models. Really, just being able to make out their facial features is already a step beyond Myth 1 or 2, though I suppose you can argue players filled in those details themselves with 2D games. Speaking of faces, I always thought many of those in Myth 3 were unusually realistic, which turns out to be because, according to a GameSpy article, they're actually face maps of the team. I don't know exactly who's who, and some are definitely just based on the original concept art, but it's still a little eerie to see them close up. Anyway, considering how little time the team had to hand massage anything, they deserve a lot of credit for a lot of other interesting visual tweaks, like arrows sticking in the ground instead of breaking and bouncing. The team were also clearly trying to capture the classic look of the old units as best they could. The Thrall, the Warriors, the Soulless and such, with some little adjustments, perhaps due to the artist's personal taste, or maybe just to remind the player this is supposedly over 1,000 years before the events of the Fallen Lords. In some areas they did pretty well. I think the Warlocks look really good, and massive credit to the team for ensuring the Mercridian Giants are still rocking those prime dad bods. But in other ways, I think they fall short, maybe to a very limited degree because of artistic differences, but in my opinion, mostly due to technological limitations. The downside to being on the cutting edge of polygonal 3D graphics is that all these models have been heavily optimized for real-time rendering. Even at a single glance from the default zoom level, you can tell that units like the Thrall and Warriors are recognizably more trigonic than their 2D counterparts. With pre-rendered models, simplistic shapes and sharp angles are not a mandatory requirement for inclusion in-game, but MumboJumbo had to work around the average hardware of the day. Helmets and heads are often a little too obviously conical or rectangular. Individual weapons and armor can occasionally seem oversized, and arms or legs may well bring to mind safety dummies. Even major characters such as Connaught, who were presumably given a higher poly budget, have clearly fallen victim to being on the wrong end of Moore's law, and things get worse with some of the larger models, in particular the Ogre and on-armored Trow. Comparatively, that is, with regard to Bungie's games, I think the regular and Pack Mage Mercridia come off especially badly, possibly because MumboJumbo seem to have gone for a bat-like look, but mostly because bodies that are probably meant to seem lean and toned instead look rather stringy and light, as if all humanity needed to dispose of them was a stiff breeze. Speaking of lighter frames, an often overlooked addition to the series are new female units. Looking at Bungie's pseudo-design doc for the original Myth, the famous Things That Suck and Things That Rock list, I was surprised to see that one of the suck entries was male-dominated pseudo-medieval society. Bungie's Myth always struck me as much more male-oriented than the conventional high fantasy it tried to distance itself from, which usually featured at the very least childhood friends, love interests, queens or princesses, Amazonian warrior woman, or similar tropes. I'd always assumed this was deliberate, either to give the series a grittier, more realistic tone in keeping with its focus on grunt work over heroes and royalty and other high fantasy staples that might include female characters, or as a nod to the Black Company, where the intrusion of the feminine, in various forms, into the company's precarious camaraderie was sort of a plot point in itself. The Fallen Lords featured no humanoid female units, or what the fetch were was never really established, and only incidentally referred to or depicted women in narrative entries or the end mission screens, all of them from the opening levels if I remember correctly, plus some vague comments in the game files and old betas. Soulblighter did feature a major female character, though her only recognizably feminine traits were explicitly vices: extreme vanity, pettiness, the usual villainous hag stuff. What this says about Bungie's relationship with their mothers, I don't know, but at least someone at MumboJumbo decided to give women a bit more of a presence in the Wolf Age. There are female peasants, used to represent livestock in certain multiplayer game modes, no comment from me, priestesses of the spider cult in a couple of levels, and the barbarian princess Ravana. Funnily enough though, adding well-endowed peasant girls, scantily clad cultists, and Red Sonja types just brings Myth full cycle back to the standard stock fantasy woman Bungie seemed to have deliberately refrained from including in the series. Oh well, I'm not complaining. Anyway, these illustrious ladies share with the male characters another big step up from the previous titles, which is an impressive array of different animations. In Myth 1 and 2, there was, mostly due to memory limitations, a limited repertoire of actions that could be assigned to each unit, hence the 2D troops almost always using the same attack and death animations or having very few idle stances, making them look a bit statue-like or clockwork at times. I don't know how much of a role the Tiki framework played in Myth 3's animation. Despite reading up on it, I found it difficult to determine exactly what role Tiki was serving here, and from some previews it seems like it wasn't the full system used in FAC 2 anyway. But no matter why, the unit animations in Myth 3 are both varied and expressive, with most units having multiple attack, flinch and death variants, plus numerous idling poses, such as inspecting their weapons or roaring at the sky, as well as different stances, depending on whether they've recently been involved in combat. I do think these sometimes go a little overboard in the interests of showing off. Ravana leaping up and down like a cheerleader isn't so bad, but I don't know what's going on with the Archer's victory dance.
Woohoo! Yeah! Alright!
On the other hand, you could argue these animations didn't go far enough. Despite being somewhat ahead of the curve, Myth 3 wasn't the first RTS to use polygonal models. In fact, several were released the same year that were heavily promoted for that same feature. I noticed that Battle Realms was released at approximately the same time as the Wolf Age, but also that several magazines reviewed Liquid's game before MumboJumbo's, either because they got their hands on review code earlier, or maybe because they considered it a higher priority. The charming and characterful unit animations in Battle Realms received a considerable amount of praise from many reviewers. I would venture because these were far more exaggerated than Myth 3's, in keeping with the generally heavier stylization of Liquid's game. Another factor perhaps was that titles like Battle Realms or Empire Earth consciously and very effectively went out of their way to show off their height-mapped landscapes and polygonal models, especially in cutscenes, even though some of these features had been a part of the Myth series since the original game. Empire Earth could arguably be described as using a sort of quasi-isometric perspective for much of the action, but would frequently on-moor the camera from its usual position during cutscenes. From a regular player or reviewer's point of view, this may have been a more impressive effect than Myth 3 simply letting you zoom or rotate the camera anytime you wanted. And Battle Realms made particularly extensive use of both 3D camera angles and unique unit animations in its in-mission storytelling. Now, this was actually one of the points Heavy Metal Fact 2 had been marketed on, how easy it would be to script the tiki animations in cutscenes. Myth 3, however, barely has any in-game cutscenes, and those that exist are not as carefully animated as those of Fact 2, whether because they ran out of time, or because, again, the fact tiki was part of a whole slew of interconnected features in Fact 2, rather than a single self-contained innovation. If Fact 2 was a Quake engine plus ritual Uber tools plus tiki animation deal, with everything working together and enhancing each other, Myth 3 was more, as I understand it, basically still just the Soulblighter engine plus some hooks for the tiki animation and extra physics. When reviewers got their hands on Myth 3, they had probably already been wowed by the unit animations in other recent 3D RTS titles, and the additional fact Myth 3 featured a more realistic art direction, or to be less charitable, a dour and unremarkable one, may not have worked in its favour. More than one reviewer suggested the Wolf Age was indeed overly dark in a very literal sense, complaining that they couldn't see anything without setting the brightness and contrast to max. And no doubt, compared to something like Battle Realms, Myth 3 would not have seemed a particularly vibrant game. GameStar, for example, dismissed the environments as too dark, dull, and samey. That shouldn't really be a new complaint. The Fallen Lords was sometimes quite keen on caves, marshes, and desert maps, but there was still plenty of colour, and then Soulblighter clearly tried to simultaneously broaden and lighten the palette even further. Myth 3 reverting somewhat to the Fallen Lords environments, combined with the heavy use of shadows and in some cases fog effects, probably made the issue worse. Coming back to the unit models, you'd assume that skeletal animations would be an obvious improvement on Bungie's 2D work, which was likened to watching wind-up clockwork soldiers by one reviewer. But I personally think something looks off with the movements in Myth 3. They look like they're straining their limbs through some thick, viscous liquid when they animate, as if an evil sorcerer has flooded the battlefield with invisible treacle. It doesn't feel like units are actually hitting each other with much strength, for example. Playing Fact 2, I don't see any indication of this problem in that game's animations, so I can't imagine the Tiki framework has anything to do with it. Or maybe it's just me, since I spent so much time playing the Wolf Age at half speed, I've probably forgotten what their natural animations look like. It could also be that the problem is not that the animations are too slow, but actually too slow and too fast. MumboJumbo apparently had to revise movement speeds a few times during development, so maybe the animations were originally meant to play at different speeds or something. And if you watch footage of the Myth games side by side, the advances in animation quality are very clear. But to actually experience comparable scenes, Berserks fighting thralls, say, I'd stake a lot on the bet that most players would agree there seems to be less impact to combat in Myth 3. That MumboJumbo had dropped the ball here was definitely a common sentiment back at release, that there was more oomph, so to speak, to battle scenes in Bungie's games. But I think a good deal of that sentiment could be attributed to issues with the sound design in Myth 3. The 1.0 version of the Wolf Age was heavily criticised in some quarters for its poor audio work. This wasn't just a matter of opinion, as the game was in fact missing a number of sound effects, ambient noise, attack and hit animations, spells, debris impact, and many more. These obvious defects, combined with what seemed like cost-saving measures like the static cutscenes, contributed to the impression that the game had been rushed out the door without any care for production values. It might be said the Myth series was particularly vulnerable to criticisms of audio design, since whereas many other games could paper over the cracks with a solid background score, in-game music was verboten to developers making a Myth game. As I mentioned in the Myth 2 video, Bungie didn't actually consider in-game action and an absence of music to be a sacred and indivisible duo. Only technical limitations had prevented them from implementing dynamic music into Soulblighter's missions. But MumboJumbo continued the tradition of limiting music to cutscenes and pre-mission briefings, meaning that solid and coherent audio design was extremely important to the Wolf Age. We can go back as far as the Fallen Lord's alpha and beta builds to understand how critical these elements can be to the overall experience. Myth's original placeholder audio ranged from, at best, adequate, to, at worst, jarringly bad.
Die!
For MumboJumbo to fumble the sound effects in Myth 3 was thus especially embarrassing and detrimental to the final product. The omissions were so obvious that a great number of those oral oversights were remedied with the first patch, but not only had the damage already been done, there were still many problems remaining. As late as March 2002, for example, Computer Games magazine, who gave Myth 3 2.5 stars, in part due to its lack of polish, complained that Trow and Ogre were still missing some of their attack sounds. The subsequent unofficial patches inherited the responsibility of fixing up Myth 3's audio, and as of patch 1.3.1, the average player probably wouldn't notice anything awry, aside from the lack of music, of course. Unfortunately, the Wolf Age couldn't just be average, it had to live up to the standards set in Bungie's games by Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore.
Step aside.
Casualty. Casualty. Casualty.
With so many units returning from previous titles in the series, there are plenty of opportunities for comparing the two approaches, and in this, Myth 3 often comes out looking poorer for it. Not everyone thought the Wolf Age was the inferior partner. Some, like GameSpot, actually considered the sound effects better than Myth 2, though I would note that several of these more positive reviews repeated lines about the audio being recorded in higher quality, which may well be true in a technical sense, but also has the whiff of journalists just regurgitating marketing talk. Side by side, warriors against Thrall, bowmen versus soulless, berserks chopping at flesh, trows striking anything, the older games just sound better.
Casualty. Casualties. Casualties. Casualty.
Casualty. Casualty.
Combat effects in particular are sometimes lacking in strength and distinctiveness, a blow to both immersion and gameplay. Marty O'Donnell pointed out that one of the goals with the sound design in the original Myth was that you could recognize what was happening anywhere on the battlefield purely from the sound effects. This is just not quite as true in the Wolf Age. Now, according to many fans, the loss of character in audio design extends to the voice work, though on this point I don't agree with critics quite as strongly.
Preposterous.
You cannot mean that.
If only it were a lie. But I cannot believe that it is.
Total Audio's collaborators on The Fallen Lords and Soulblighter, the voice actors for numerous units and storytellers, are well known to Myth aficionados, though names like Bob O'Donnell, Tony Mackes, Jeff Morrow, or Jeffrey Charlton Perrin might not be immediately familiar to fans. They'd still likely recognise many of their memorable battle cries, death screams, dialogue, or narration.
Fearing for their safety, the villagers here pleaded with us to remain when we broke camp this morning. None of them understand yet what is happening, but they have all seen the refugees from the south, and they are frightened.
But in the Wolf Age, all of Myth 1 and 2's voice actors have been replaced with newcomers, with MumboJumbo staff also occasionally filling in a missing line or two. I did read quite a bit of negative feedback to this change. GameStar, for example, complained that the new narrator, Nick Eldritch, sounded tired and uninterested.
With the falling of the sun, unearthly cries undulated from hidden caves, as devils stalked out of their shadowy nests to feast upon beast and man alike. They were the Mercridia, and they were slowly hunting humanity into extinction.
Drive-by comments on message boards also communicated disappointment with the cast. Complaints about Eldritch's delivery are difficult to extricate from distaste for the writing and narrative as a whole, when PC Gamer refers to the relentlessly verbose backstory, for example. Personally, I didn't really see much wrong with the narration. It's different to Myths, for sure, but both the speaker and the context in which they're delivering their lines is different too.
Connacht was suddenly overcome with a vision of the past, a history long before his birth, when a race of power incarnate walked the lands. The device held by Moagim was none other than a rod of the Keliach.
Similarly, like many players, I miss the classic unit barks for orders, attacking, and so on, but I don't think Myth 3's VAs are doing anything wrong in that regard. There are still a few lines that stuck in my head for years after I first played it.
For the Emperor, yes, my liege. Make way for the dwarf at once.
All the same, there are a handful of instances in which I side with the critics, namely the work done by the leads. I don't have any particular issue with the talent at work. Most of Myth 3's VAs were already reasonably experienced by late 2001, in some cases better established than the original Myth cast, so it's not like they were underqualified or anything. But not all of them were necessarily the best fit for the characters. Damas and Murdred, for example, sometimes sound a bit too young to be playing these figures.
A quest? That'll solve any boredom I've gained by training the troops.
Great one. We ask your aid in the battle against the dark.
Majarin, meanwhile, is almost clownish, so exaggerated that I don't think it's too big of a spoiler to reveal the character is not going to be a close ally, and who sounds even more ridiculous in context later on in the narrative. In short, I think a lot of the leads sound either too weak or too exaggerated.
Such insolence! Ha! I see the two of you will get along splendidly.
Whether some thought Myth 3's soundtrack had also gone a little overboard is a question I'm not completely sure on. Taking over from the now legendary Marty O'Donnell was Ritual Entertainment's Zach Belliker, who had previously scored Sin and Heavy Metal Fact 2. Whether by direction or shared intent, Belliker's music is very much in keeping with Scott Campbell's interest in Celtic mythology, with pipes, flutes, and horns rarely absent for long. According to a behind-the-scenes promo originally posted as part of the marketing campaign, Belica had hoped to hire an Eastern European orchestra to perform the score. Apparently, due to budget limitations, as well as a desire to make the music sound more, quote, primitive, this idea was dropped. Instead, Myth 3's soundtrack was mostly composed of digital samples, but with some tracks aided by live recordings of cellist Laurie Goldston. In furtherance of lending the score a tribal theme, Belica relied heavily on samples of primitive drums, uilleann pipes, and Tibetan horns. At other points, a more folksy tone is struck with fiddles and flutes, and on occasion, harps and string instruments are used to communicate a sort of proto-medieval regality befitting barbarian kings and their courts. I hinted a little earlier though that some listeners may not have cared for this insistence on pop Gallicism, with PC Gamer sneering that Myth 3's brain-achingly dull narrative consisted of, quote, badly composed Celtic-themed nonsense that's about as authentic as an Irish pub. PC Gamer may just have been speaking figuratively of the writing, not the music, but to say Belica's score is overwrought in a similar manner would not be stretching the truth too far. Not necessarily a bad thing, let alone inappropriate to a pre-millennial prequel emerging from the mists of history. Appreciative comments on Myth 3's soundtrack are not hard to find in reviews of the day, and even now you'll hear some of the game's more vociferous critics insist it's deserving of praise. Still, it is possible to have too much of a good thing. The main menu themes can get a bit much once you've listened to them enough times, though maybe that's just a problem of sound mixing and transitions, and I remember finding one of Myth 2's menu tracks a bit irritating after a while too. One more obvious shortcoming, in my opinion, is that the music used for Myth 3's pre-mission briefings doesn't seem to be well integrated with the narrative structure of the story being told. What I mean by that is that in Myth 1's briefings, and improved upon significantly in Myth 2's, the music seemed composed for the text crawl and narration, swelling at appropriate points, fading at others, transitioning into a different tone, and so forth. Consider this example from Myth 2's Gate of Storms.
One among them told us of being captured and dragged before a woman so disfigured by injury and age that he turned from her repulsed. In a rage, she gouged out his eyes and shrieked, "Tell Ulrich his nightmare has just begun," and released him to stumble out of the conquered city. I believe something about the message has unsettled our king.
Now compare that to the relationship, or lack thereof, between narrative and music in Myth 3's Dream Duel.
Connacht was summoned by the Emperor. He told Connacht that he wished to personally lead the army of Landgrafen into battle. Connacht, surprised at the Emperor's sudden change of mind, asked if his idea was a sound one. Majoran stated that the bidding of the Emperor would be followed. Before Connacht could rebuke the advisor, Emperor Leitrim gently asked Connacht if he would let an old man lead his people to their greatest glory. Connacht could not bring himself to refuse his wishes.
This is a fairly consistent pattern across both games. Myth 2's music usually matches the mood, shifting when necessary, whilst Myth 3's just blissfully, or blithely, drones on in the background irrespective of what Nick Eldritch is reading. That doesn't necessarily matter too much. Some of the Fallen Lord's briefings work fine like that, but there are definitely moments when you feel the music isn't really enhancing the story. This could just be yet another consequence of Myth 3's rushed development, although I think there's a good chance differing production philosophies also played a part. In Zach Belica's promo piece, he mentioned that he had to write the music before knowing exactly how it would be implemented in-game, then given feedback from MumboJumbo, then revising them in response, and so on, which sounds like a fairly typical process for many video games. Working alongside Scott Campbell, Bellica essentially had an outline with concepts like journey for when the mission involved travelling, mourning for sad events, and the rest you can probably guess. In effect, and based on his description for each track, Bellica had an idea of the general theme for each piece, but not much control or understanding of how it would be utilised in-game. The Fallen Lords, however, was unusual at the time for how closely integrated into the production process Total Audio were, the benefits of which, on the Myth series and then on Halo, Marty O'Donnell has extolled in numerous interviews. So putting O'Donnell/Salvatore and Bellica's work side by side isn't really fair. The scores were made under very different circumstances, and targeting an even more dissimilar tone, with Bellica trying to capture mythological feats of strength and honour, and, in theory, chronicling fabled events vastly beyond the scope of the Fallen Lord's petty little skirmishes. Like pretty much everyone on the Myth 3 team, he was working within tight constraints that made what he did achieve all the more worthy of credit. In that spirit, even though the Wolf Age may be considered eminently missable by many Myth fans, it seems unfair to let the game rot without at least considering some of the various ways you can still play it today. As mentioned in the opening, as of writing, there's no easy way to get your hands on Myth 3. Legally speaking, eBay or some such for old physical copies is your only option. But even putting aside the problems with the release build, you can run into odd cross-region compatibility issues, like different versions of the English language build that aren't compatible with patches for other English language releases. I ran into this problem myself back in November 2001 when the first patch hit. 1.02 was, and remains, the only official or semi-official Windows patch for the game. Similarly, the Vengeance editing toolset for Mac or PC was polished up for public release on former MumboJumbo staff's own time, but never officially supported, and is famously unstable. Now, with the 1.02 patch, Myth 3 wasn't in that awful a state. I remember it fixed some of the most critical bugs from the release build, and I believe I played through it a couple of times that way, without noticing any serious problems. Still, plenty of smaller issues remained, including compatibility with various operating systems, widescreen monitors, and all the usual stuff. Most people who want to try Myth 3 thus turn to the unofficial patches by Myth developers, then Flying Flip Studios, and finally Elusive Mind, if my chronology isn't completely off. The latest patch is 1.3.1, which you can find on Myth fan site The Tane, and with the weight of several years of unofficial tweaks and fixes, this is probably the most stable, and certainly the most common means of playing Myth 3 nowadays. On top of bug fixes, it removed some redundant features, added native widescreen support, implemented a new system for plugins, and made some additions to the multiplayer, though with the loss of both GameSpy and MariusNet, there's not much point mentioning any of the online features. The enhanced version of Vengeance, Ballistic, is also worth mentioning for those curious about modding the game. With 1.3.1, you stand the best chance of running Myth 3 without any major issues, and at your monitor's native resolution. Even so, there are a few points that should be mentioned. First, even with the patch, you'll probably have issues with cutscenes, music, and narration, due to the game relying on Apple QuickTime to run them. It's possible that you'll have to install some newer variant of QuickTime to actually get music and narration during the briefings, or to play the pre-rendered cutscenes, though people have had mixed results depending on their circumstances, not helped by the fact a lot of people are probably using abandonware copies with some of the assets ripped out. Personally, I was able to get the music, narration, and static cutscenes running, but the pre-rendered cutscenes were a bit bugged in-game. On top of this, Flying Flip's implementation of widescreen isn't perfect. Aside from stretching rather than keeping the original aspect ratio of the briefing and interstitial cutscenes, changing the layout of these sequences messes up their timing, so the text will scroll past the screen faster than the pictorial aids and leave you looking at an empty space for some time before the music fades out. There are also some visual glitches, some I think the result of widescreen, like misaligned or defective interface effects, others added by one of the patches, like the ugly shading behind subtitles, or even worse, the permanent multiplayer team list that appears when you load a single player game or try to watch a recorded recorded film, a feature you can disable in multiplayer but not solo. Some bugs I think are just left over from the original game, like fireballs and white explosions bugging out water or grass sprites, or the game reloading projectile effects upon each save, resulting in weird situations like a boss fight that slows to a crawl because the game keeps spawning new poison effects. Moreover, even on modern systems, Myth 3 can still have some general performance issues, which I think are related to either pathfinding level scripts or possibly water of all things, as well as potentially rather long load times even on an SSD. And although numerous adjustments to the gameplay were made post-October 2001, overall Myth 3 just isn't a particularly well-polished or balanced game, so expect to see some broken collision detection or poorly defined terrain boundaries, scripting or AI bugs, and possibly the odd crash, although I don't recall the latter occurring for me. There also seems to be a limit to how many save games it can display, a terrible indignity for anyone trying to play in Legendary mode. All that aside, if you can install Myth 3 and the unofficial patches at all, then it should be playable from start to finish. As an addendum to the original game, it's worth reminding those interested in playing that despite dying out so quickly, the Wolf Age did receive a number of maps and mods. I won't devote a special section to these, as there's not enough content for it to really be worth the trouble. As you'd imagine, the majority of these were made for competitive net games, starting with conversions of classic battlegrounds from Myth 1 and 2, and eventually creating original content, sometimes with custom assets like Christmas-themed maps, to alpha conversions of popular Myth 2 mods like World War II Recon. But some solo levels were also produced, mostly between 2002 and 2004, with one or two made using later tools. These can be a bit hard to track down, as even the Tane only managed to save a few of them, and when other map-making sites shuttered, the Wolf Age mods were generally considered a very low priority. Among the ones I was able to find were some remakes of Myth 1 and 2 levels, such as Bagrada, Down a Broken Path, and The Stair of Grief. The first two seemed to work fine, and it was interesting to revisit them in the Myth 3 engine, although the latter seemed prone to crashes, and I wasn't able to finish it for that reason. And to be honest, playing through them using the Wolf Age's gameplay and production values somewhat illustrates just how badly MumboJumbo fell short of Bungie's standards. But on top of these ports, some new solo maps were made as well, such as Traitor of Darkness and Light, two variants of a hero-oriented mission that can be a bit unstable but are nevertheless possible to finish. There's also that ever-popular staple of Myth mods, a unit reversal mod for the single-player campaign, which swaps out light units for dark and vice versa. You can find this on the Tane under Inversion, and it can be a fun diversion or challenge for those who've already finished the game. Another custom level I was able to track down was Taliesin Downs 2, but I wasn't able to actually get this working as it always crashed during the intro. I'm guessing it was made for an earlier build of Myth 3 and is presumably incompatible with 1.31. If there are any other worthwhile solo mods you're aware of, feel free to mention them in the comments. Though as far as I know, there are no major mission packs or conversions that would by themselves really incentivize someone to install Myth 3. Indeed, perhaps the most notable fan-made edition for Myth 3 isn't actually for Myth 3 at all. It's the Myth 3 public beta, a fan port of Myth 3 to the Myth 2 engine, or rather the Project Magma build of the engine. I'm a little sketchy on the exact history of this mod, but from stalking people on the Tane forums, I think it's an amalgam of earlier abandoned attempts at making a Myth 3 mod, combined with various custom units made by the community over the years. It seems to have been kickstarted by the user Darthravan555, who began working on maps using assets from other mod makers, then recruited a small team to make some additional content and polish the whole thing up. The project was first publicly released in 2016, but to date is still considered an unofficial endeavour in need of some additional models, cleaning up maps and fixing bugs, and generally balancing everything to work together properly. I don't want to get into the specifics of who to credit for what, because I'm not 100% sure and people can be prickly about that sort of thing, but that seems to be the general gist of the mod's development. It's an interesting idea to take a game from late 2001 and and remake it in an engine from 1998 that for the last 20 years has itself been touched up in various ways. So in essence, Myth 3 public beta is Myth 3 if it were made in the style of Myth 2. Taking a broad view of the mod, I'd say it's roughly 80% complete, and can almost be played start to finish, depending on whether you're willing to make certain compromises. The majority of the levels are working and playable, most of the art has been replaced, the majority of units use their correct abilities and so on, and most of the scripting is done. Pre-mission briefings and interstitials have been ported pretty much directly from Myth 3, so if you're interested in the story of the Wolf Age, you'd be getting a pretty accurate approximation of it by playing this mod. Technologically, there are still some rough spots. In some cases, scripts seem to be a bit temperamental, and there was one level, which seems to be the most obviously unfinished anyway, that I couldn't finish at all. Plus, there are still a few obvious placeholders, like some of the heroes using Myth 1 or 2 sprites, or conversions of 3D models from completely different games. The real barrier to getting through the mod, though, is the lack of balancing. In levels 1 and 2, the Macridia are mostly their tougher variants, and seem to be timed to attack earlier than they're supposed to, which your own forces are not really capable of standing up to under normal circumstances. The issue of scripts misfiring or going off too early seems to happen in other levels, forcing you into extremely tough fights before you're ready, or triggering virtual game over scenarios without justification. I could only complete Rod of the Kaliach, for example, with some very silly cheesing. There are some missions, like Gates of Mirgard, that also seemed virtually impossible to complete even on the default difficulty, and in other missions, like Imprisonment, critical mechanics seem to be disabled. If you're willing to set the difficulty to its lowest, however, you shouldn't have too much trouble getting through most of the levels. And keep in mind, obviously, that since you'll be playing on the modified Soulblighter engine, you can pause and give orders, or set the game speed to well below what was originally permitted. So on the whole, I think that even those who've played the Wolf Age might get something out of giving Myth 3 public beta a go. In fact, even though some Myth fans recommend playing this rather than the real Myth 3, in some ways it actually feels like it's aimed at players who've already finished MumboJumbo's game. Rather than being a one-to-one port of the Myth 3 missions, the level designers have added numerous twists to the challenges of the original, possibly, and I'm not 100% sure of this, based on MumboJumbo's original design docs for these levels. Enemy groups spawn where in the Wolf Age they would not, even on Legendary, and in some cases there are enemy types present that were never part of MumboJumbo's levels. Macridia on Flight from the Dark, or Undead on the Heartstone of Nyx. Indeed, although on average this mod is harder than Myth 3, in a handful of cases it actually seems more balanced, such as on Bonds of the Ogre. In production values, audio-wise it seems to use a mix of Myth 2 and Myth 3 assets, frequently using the Myth 2 version in cases where they sound superior, which I think was a wise decision. Visually, however, it's a bit inconsistent. Being built in the upgraded Soulblighter engine, some of the landscapes and water surfaces actually look better than those of Myth 3, but the models and sprites don't always gel with the rest of the assets. Some sprites are high-quality fan models, some are Myth 3's real-time polygonal models converted to 2D art, and some are from unrelated games or other mods. They can sometimes look a bit strange lined up next to each other, or seem out of place when there's a gap in quality between, say, an environmental prop, like a 2D tree, and a highly detailed ground texture. These assets sometimes look far better than the 20-year-old polygonal 3D models of the Wolf Age, though naturally tend to look a bit jerkier in motion or when rotating the camera, depending on how many animation frames they have. However, there are a couple of areas in which a Myth 2 mod has no chance of touching the Wolf Age: lighting effects and physics. Playing a level like Mazarin's Crypt highlights how impressive the lighting and shadows in Myth 3 were, and how noticeably their absence undermines the atmosphere of the level. And during regular levels, you don't have so many dynamic lights in evidence, or trees bending away from wind and explosions. In general, it just looks a bit flat, and highlights how difficult it is for a well-meaning amateur project to match the standards of a team of professionals, even one working 20 years ago on a limited budget and time time frame. But even if not completely playable from start to finish, and undermined by balancing issues, the Myth 3 public beta is a pretty stunning achievement, and worth giving a chance if you're a Myth fan, especially if you're unwilling or unable to run the Wolf Age proper. But I think we've covered all we need to about Myth 3, bar one last important element. MumboJumbo, and specifically Scott Campbell, had their work cut out for them in creating a new chapter, or prologue if you like, for a series whose fanbase were so rabidly enthusiastic when it came to both storytelling and lore. Having had no involvement with the scripts for the original games, and by his own account, so blind to their attractions that he was almost ashamed of his ignorance after his visit to Bungie in 1997, Campbell keenly felt the weight of responsibility in crafting the backstory and retelling of one of the most legendary eras in Myth's history. So let's finish the video by revisiting the tale Campbell told of the closing of the Wind Age, a millennia before the Great War against the Fallen Lords, before the raising of the Cathbruig Empire, the treachery of the Head, and the return of the Three Fallen. That past age was one in which devils made prey of humanity, when the Trow's empire of iron seemed unassailable, and when heroes and villains would forge friendships and rivalries that would burn brightly for 1,000 years thereafter. It was the time of Connacht, and the coming of the Wolf Age.
The Fallen Lords, Balor, Soulblighter, Shiver, the Deceiver. Their names stir in us the most primal of fears. Yet the legends of our forefathers tell a different tale, that these lords of the fallen were not always the terrifying horrors we remember.
Many are the races that have trodden the world of myth, and many are those who will never do so again. The children of Nyx, those towering giants of stone and clay known as the Trow, say they were the first, moulded by their goddess before the birthing of the world. The younger and lesser civilizations soon learned to stay well clear of the Trow's iron empire. Those that had made war on them were annihilated. So too, then, were the sorceress Kaliach for merely standing in their way. And when hasty words were spoken by the ogre, their entire race was broken and clapped in chains to serve as slaves forevermore. Yet as these cataclysmic battles were being fought, the barbaric tribes of humanity began to spread across the known lands. Their petty struggles to forge great tribal confederations went mostly unheeded by the faraway Trow, who saw neither threat nor worth in the savage and fragile peoples who scurried beneath their ironclad feet. Only humanity's enemies, their own brethren and those people too weak to resist man's lust for conquest, cared for their actions. Across many generations, through ages that to the immortal Trow seemed mere moments of time, humanity's endless internecine conflicts sprouted warring city-states, and eventually primitive kingdoms built by ambitious warlords upon fields of blood and bone. In the course of humanity's age of darkness, mystical powers emerged among men, the arts of sorcery, summoning, dreaming, and diabolism. Yet sometime during this long and ignorant era, something else was birthed. A formless atrocity of malevolent intent that brought nothing but tyranny and destruction. This accursed entity would possess the body of some great warrior or ruler, and plunge mankind into an age of ceaseless violence, only to be banished through the efforts of some desperate alliance of survivors that still clung to the scraps of civilization. Yet that monstrous will would always return, puppeting some new form, to once more bring humankind to the brink of extinction, and to once more be banished to the unknown beyond. After uncounted epochs of humanity rising and falling and rising anew, enough shreds of recorded history accumulated across the years that scholars began to piece together a pattern to this violent cycle. Without fail, a golden age of progress and plenty would be interrupted by the arrival of a great comet in the eastern sky, heralding the appearance of the dark entity. Much of man's achievements would be wiped out, his jeweled cities laid low, armies scattered, halls of knowledge buried, and the spark spark of humanity almost snuffed out for good. Then, on the eve of the entity's ultimate victory, the comet would pass in the west, and a great hero would emerge to swat the entity aside and lead man into a new golden age. But after 1,000 years, the annihilating entity, this leveler, would return in the body of the same legendary hero that had banished it, putting the cycle of darkness and light in motion once again. So it was that Sorengath the Flayed was poised to crush the city-state of Tirith Danor, only for the poet-philosopher Tiresias to rally the scattered army of men behind him and lead them to victory. But though Tiresias beheaded the Leveler in a climactic battle between the forces of darkness and light, the mantle of Leveler would live on, and in the very form that had been its undoing. Even with this cataclysmic cosmic constant, some of man's possessions survived, or at least endured through the cycles. Some were products of evil intent, such as the dream of on-life plundered by Belial from the flooded ruins of Siwanon. There, the man that would become known as the Watcher reanimated the art of necromancy, which, like Belial himself, was thereafter a dark constant in the lands of men. Others were the fruit of man's halting appetite for peace and learning over conquest and bloodshed. The warlord Clovis united many of man's kingdoms into the mighty Cathbruig Empire, which would reign supreme throughout the Age of Reason, extending its borders to the Cloudspine Mountains and securing pacts with the hardy dwarves of Mirgard. And the Avatara Mazarin founded the Citadel of Ilwan, where mages of all stripes, including the more benevolent practitioners of necromancy, gathered in pursuit of knowledge and instruction. But no man or mage could escape being touched by the Great Cycle. In the course of its history, the Cathbruig would weather countless disasters, from civil war to the plague of Belial to the terrible schism in the schools of magic that spawned the ruthless order of Scholomance, emerging stronger from them all. But even with all its armies and arcane allies, it quailed at the return of the Leveler. Clad in the dead flesh of Tiresias, now calling itself Moagim, the Faceless Terror, the entity threw black magics and endless legions of the Walking Dead against the Cathbruig Empire. Even so, it seemed that the progress made in the Age of Reason might finally have outpaced the Leveler. After years of conflict, Moagim was beaten back, outmatched by the disciplined Imperial troops and the Avatara of the Citadel. Knowing his days were numbered, Moagim performed a terrible ritual that opened a door into a distant world of nightmares, espying there horrific beasts that gave even him pause. With all his remaining might, he seized their attentions and beckoned them towards the doorway. Moagim was soon captured, drawn and quartered outside Ilwan, laughing as his body was torn to pieces. Before the echoes of the Leveler's last moments had faded, tales spread of the Mircridia, a horde of monstrous nocturnal creatures of infinite numbers and a bottomless appetite for flesh. It took merely a handful of years for the Mircridia to tear the Cathbruig Empire apart, as brutally as it had their summoner. The beasts devoured the people of every city, every province in the Empire, until only the capital city of Lankafin held out, and those unfortunates isolated from the safety of its walls, huddling in the darkness of far-flung settlements to await their inevitable doom. Though for once seemingly lacking its figurehead, the Age of Darkness had come anew, and with it, the passing of the Age of Reason to the Wind Age. It is now the year 1426 AE, 1,000 years since Moagim fell, and dragged much of civilization down with him. Lankafin still stands, the one beacon of light in a world of encroaching night, and ruled by the aging Emperor Leotrim, who is perhaps destined to be the last of his line. Outside the city, only scattered nomads, peasants, and refugees remain of the once flourishing empire, centered around the farmlands of the Downs, which endure only thanks to the remaining forces of the Cathbruig. And across the nigh impassable Cloudspine, new settlements, nominally allies of Lankafin, have formed into the nascent western provinces. Besides this, all that endures of humanity in the known lands are barbarous tribals, chiefly the nomadic myrmidons of the 12 Duns, and the battle-hardened warriors of Gower, who struggle valiantly against their inevitable destruction. The dwarven kingdoms have fared little better than man, for the twin cities of Mirgard and Stoneheim slowly but surely lose ground against the migrating Gauls, and the Trow, as always, remain unconcerned with the affairs of humanity, caring only for the plundered iron their ogre slaves tear from the earth. Such was the boundless savagery and hunger of the rampaging Myrcridia that today many of their race have become fat and lazy, having gorged themselves so long and so thoroughly on easy human flesh. Whole swathes of these creatures have lost much of their ferocity and strength, and though they retain their feral instincts, they are perhaps a hair less nightmarish than their ancestors. But even in their weakened and degenerated state, the Myrcridia are no less capable of fulfilling Moagim's genocidal dream. As desperately as the people of Gower fight against the Myrcridian hordes, no force of men has ever survived a concerted assault. Whole villages are consumed, their defenders butchered and eaten along with their families and friends. Though the war against the Myrcridia has made the Gowans a tough and resourceful people, there seems no hope of deliverance. Only one man, an orphan of the Myrcridian raids, believes that his people have a chance. Clad in heavy furs, towering over his fellows, this wolf man has no fear of the devils, for in his youth, standing amidst the burning wreckage of his village, his own young hands once split a Myrcridian's head in twain. In the years since the murder of his family and friends, he has made prey of the creatures, hunting them through the dire marsh where they make their homes, earning the epithet of Devil Slayer. When his clan home, the town of Ursgrad, finally comes under attack, it is the Devil Slayer who rallies his people in a last stand against the unstoppable horde. In the battle that follows, he proves as able a leader as he is a warrior, commanding the men of Gower as skillfully as any seasoned general, and personally slaying scores of devils with his massive two-headed axe. Ursgrad proves unbreakable against the Myrcridia, and with the torn bodies of the beasts carpeting the earth, the horde flees, marking the first victory of humanity against the Night in 1,000 years. News of the crushing defeat inflicted upon the beasts spreads like wildfire, and the elders of Ursgrad bestow upon the wolf the name Connacht, or Deliverance. The other clans of Gower quickly rally to Connacht, who leads them to further victories against the Myrcridia. Soon, the clans unite under their saviour, and the nation of Gower is born, with Connacht at its head, ever at the forefront of the campaign against the devils. Within the space of a few years, Gower has driven the beasts all the way back to the dire marsh, and in the year 1430, Connacht launches the final stage of his assault, leading his warriors into the heart of the local Myrcridia's lairs and slaughtering them all. Word of Connacht's unprecedented success soon reached the ears of Emperor Leotrim in Lancafin. The Cathbruig could scarcely believe the news, for even their sophisticated and disciplined armies had never defeated the Myrcridia in open battle, let alone taken the fight to their nests. Yet any joy the Emperor might derive from these rumours was tempered by far darker news. Numerous reports had reached the court of armies of corpses at the Empire's borders, led by a great necromancer who claimed to be Moagim reborn. Disturbed by the possibility of the weakened Lancafin now facing both the Myrcridia and this mysterious foe, Leotrim dispatches the captain of his Heron Guard, Damas, to Gower, hoping to confirm the truth of Connacht's victories and find some use for the barbarian king. When Damas and his Heron Guards met with Connacht, they were unimpressed by his brutish and feral manner, not to mention his complete lack of respect towards the Imperial delegation. Connacht agreed to return with the Cathbruig troops to Lancafin, though Damas and his men shunned the Wolfman's company. But when an ambush was sprung on the party on the road home, Connacht showed the Lancafin men his worth by rescuing Damas from the Myrcridia. The small force battled their way through both the Myrcridia and hordes of undead, and Damas quickly learned to regret the foolish pride he had first displayed towards Connacht. The two reached the court of Leotrim, where the Heron Guard captain spoke in support of the wolf, advising the Emperor to recruit the barbarian to train the armies of the Cathbruig, swearing that so confident was he in Connacht's abilities, he would even consent to serve under his command. The Emperor's chief advisor, Majarin of Scholarmans, spoke out against Connacht, belittling him as a savage, but Leotrim was both impressed and amused by the Gowan king. It was agreed that Connacht would train a company of the Emperor's troops, and in return, Lancafin would offer Gower the protection of their armies. The 200 men under Connacht's command soon earned acclamation and accolades, toasted by the Emperor himself for their successes, and even the Avatara of Ilwan took notice, appointing a young initiate, Myrddrid, as an observer. Though young and frail, no match for the swordsmanship of his peers, Myrddrid was both learned and greatly greatly skilled in magic, impressing even Connacht with the breadth of his knowledge and astute mind for strategy and tactics. The skills of Connacht's company would be put to their greatest test when they were sent to the Downs to investigate rumours that the Mircridia had been seen, accompanied by an army of corpses. Tracking a Mircridian pack mage to his lair and slaying him, Connacht's men discovered an ancient tome of black magics, which only Myrddred seemed capable of understanding. The company returned to Lancafin, where they were feted by the assembled court for their victory against the Mircridia, and a few days later, Myrddred called a war council to discuss his discoveries. The Avatara revealed that the tome was the work of Moagim, who had indeed returned to the world and was teaching the Mircridia the art of necromancy. But the tome also revealed another great secret, the location of Moagim's camp, where he was still raising forces in preparation for an attack on Lancafin. Connacht immediately saw the value of this revelation, and boldly proposed that the Emperor give him command of a regiment of his finest men, who could launch a surprise attack on Moagim and destroy him before he became too powerful. The Emperor eventually acceded to Connacht's request, and the army marched to the shores of the deep, where Moagim's camp lay virtually undefended. Confident that his forces remained undiscovered, Connacht launched a three-pronged assault on Moagim's camp, only to discover to his horror that he had fallen into a trap. As Connacht's men assaulted the camp, thousands of corpse soldiers erupted from the dirt beneath them, directed by a thin, shadowy figure that was none other than Balal the Watcher, the most powerful necromancer to walk the face of the world. Then, a horde of Mircridia charged from Moagim's camp, their pack mages blasting Connacht's men apart with bolts of lightning. And from behind Connacht's army, there was a thunder of footfalls. Titanic trow warriors clad in black iron strode amidst the men of Lancafin, each swing of their gigantic hammers slaying rank upon rank of helpless soldiers. In the centre of the camp, Moagim threw back his head and roared in triumph. Connacht ordered the retreat, fleeing with the remainder of his army to Lancafin and bringing news of Moagim's dark alliance with Balal and the Trow. His spirit crushed along with his army, Connacht moved to depart the city and return to Gower to prepare his people for the coming darkness. He was stopped by Myrddred and Damas, who begged him to remain, insisting that it was only his leadership that had saved their forces from total annihilation, and that it was Lancafin and her remaining armies that served the best chance to repel Moagim. Myrddred had spent much time studying the ancient tomes, and proposed a wild plan to counter the overwhelming might of the Leveler. Since Moagim had recruited the Watcher to his side, why could the Cathbruig not make common cause with his ancient enemy, Mazarin, the first Avatara? Damas scoffed at the plan. Mazarin was slain by the Watcher centuries ago, and even if he had somehow survived, no living man would know where to find him. Whilst the three of them argued, a young woman named Ravana approached Damas, a princess of the 12 Duns who had come to seek aid for her beleaguered clanspeople. Her intrusion was not welcomed by the captain of the Heron Guard, who waved her off. Unperturbed by this interruption, Myrddred insisted that Mazarin remained in the world, as powerful as ever, and that his place of repose was known to the Avatara, arguing the three of them should travel there and seek an alliance. Overhearing this, Ravana demanded that she be allowed to accompany them, swearing she would pursue any means to protect her people from the ravages of the Leveler. Damas angrily dismissed her, saying she was of no use to the party, and the two began quarrelling. At once exasperated and intrigued by Myrddred's gamble, Connacht consented to the plan and joked that Ravana's presence would be welcome, on the condition she and the Heron Guard stopped quarrelling like they were lovers. The four heroes travelled to the ancient bowels of Forest Heart, where the world remained as it had been at the beginning of time. Their journey brought the heroes closer together, and even Damas and Ravana's constant bickering gradually became less contentious and more playful. The four discovered Mazarin's crypt, surviving ambushes from the unquiet and baleful dead, and penetrated the darkness within, where both evil spirits and luminous beings from beyond stalked the halls. The group reached Mazarin's chamber, where they found the founder of Illawan did indeed live, in a manner of speaking, his desiccated flesh still trembling with magical energy, his fearful gaze a window into millennia of forbidden knowledge. But Mazarin had abandoned the world above, claiming to have liberated himself from the cycle of light and dark that governed the lives of mortals. He took interest only after Connacht's taunting reminder of his death at the hands of the Watcher, and on a whim granted them 2 boons. The first was a portion of his wisdom and power, which he granted to Myrddred. The second, as much a curse as a gift, was his knowledge of both the history of the world and its future, which he forced forcefully bestowed upon Connacht. In a single excruciating moment, the Wolf of Gower was filled with the knowledge of all that was and all that will be. Not the petty facts of every name and date or the endless churn of disposable heroes and villains that accompanied the passing of the comet, but the reality of the cycle of light and dark, the great movements and objects of power that had or would earn a place in the annals of history. From that moment, Connacht was changed, no longer merely a great warrior and leader, but a fulcrum upon which history rested, and one that now knew its role in the world. The heroes returned to Lancafin, and immediately upon their arrival, Connacht headed to the dwarven smiths of Muirthemne, whose forges could supply wonders of magic and engineering. Connacht described to the smith Traval an artifact of great power, the Tain, which its wielder could use to trap entire armies. Traval knew of this device, yet to build it, he would require the Uncarak Tomen, the dwarven book of building. Only one copy of this tome existed, in the besieged dwarven capital of Mirgard, and at that moment, news reached Lancafin of a great army of Gauls marching across the Badlands to deal a final blow to the city. Connacht persuaded the Emperor to grant him a small force to rush to Mirgard's aid, who reached the dwarven lands just in time. Annihilating the Gaul army en route to the city, the Cathbruig fell upon the besiegers from behind, who were soon crushed by the combined attack of Lancafin and Mirgard's defenders. With the alliance between man and dwarf renewed, Connacht and his men, along with a company of dwarven demolitionists, returned to Lancafin. With the Tain completed, Connacht wasted no time leading an army back into the Dire Marsh, to destroy the remaining Mircridia once and for all. The force was subjected to repeated assaults from the Mircridia, yet each time they appeared, Connacht held aloft the Tain and swept them from the world. The beasts were powerless against the artifact's power, and the army marched deeper into the Mircridian lands, Connacht and the Tain ever at its head, magicking away every horde of devils in their path. Only in the deepest part of the marsh did they meet their match, where the ancient and immortal pack mage Thalor the Black, who learned the arts from Moagim himself, neutered the power of the Tain. But even this proved but a brief obstacle, for Connacht led a small group of men into the heart of the pack mage's black spire, smashing the occult eye that granted the creature its power, slaying Thalor, and scouring the tower with the Tain. The Mircridia had nowhere to hide, and no way to resist Connacht. 1,000 years after the coming of the night, the Cathbruig finally enacted their vengeance against the Devilkin, and when their work was done, no Mircridian beast remained to walk the face of myth. But even with this momentous victory, Lancafin still faced 3 dire threats. Belial still commanded a sea of undead, and spun dream magic far beyond that of any mortal mage. The Iron Warriors of the Trow were like demigods on the battlefield, and in the annals of history, not one of the younger races had been able to resist their might. And the Leveler himself was both a skilled necromancer and an inhumanly devious strategist. The last of those threats was even nearer than the Empire knew, for Moagim was enraged by the destruction of his Mircridian pets, aborting his attack on the outlying settlements of the Empire and marching straight for the capital. A war council of the Emperor's top generals was interrupted by the news that Moagim had arrived at the outskirts of the city and was preparing to launch an attack. A desperate defense of Lancafin repulsed wave upon wave of shambling corpses. Many times the Trow and their ogre slaves almost breached the city, only to be thrown back at great cost. Even Moagim himself could not overcome its defenders. After a series of costly failures, Moagim's armies withdrew to their siege camps, but the men and dwarves of the city did not rest easy. Though Moagim had been struck many times by an eagle-eyed archer or skilled swordsman, he was utterly impervious to any sort of wound, cutting down the greatest of the Heron Guard and incinerating whole groups of men with his magic. The Emperor's council knew that, eventually, the weight of Moagim's newly risen corpses, or Trow allies, would ensure Lancafin's defeat. Connacht observed that Moagim had clutched in his hand a small gilded scepter, the Rod of the Kaliach, and Murdred revealed that it was this artifact, powered by an elaborate ritual, that granted the Leveler his invulnerability. Hearing of this, the citadel of Ilwan provided a glint of hope. In the heart of the citadel stood a world knot, a device that could transport men anywhere in the world in the blink of an eye, so long as another knot functioned at their destination. The Avatar knew what Moagim did not, that one such knot lay close to his encampment. One of the oldest and most respected of the Avatara, Sardonak, volunteered to lead a suicide mission through the world knot, striking at the ritual site that empowered the Rod of the Kaliach and robbing Moagim of his resistance to harm. Sardonak and his men sacrificed their lives to destroy the rod, and Moagim, suddenly struck with the curse of mortality, fled Lancafin with the trow. The siege had been lifted, and the Empire saved, but the victory at the capital had done little to change the inevitable course of the war. Eventually, Moagim would regain his strength, and return with an even greater force of walking dead, no doubt accompanied by both the Iron Trow and the Watcher. Alone, any one of these threats might mean Lancafin's undoing, and when combined, they were a guarantee of the Empire's doom. Connacht, touched by Mazarin's gift, knew all this and more. He knew that someone among the Imperial leadership was a traitor. He knew that Lancafin's survival could only be bought with the blood of many other peoples. And he knew that it was his destiny to bring other terrifying artifacts into being, even more destructive than the Tain. One of these was the subject of his next visit to the Forge Master Traval. The Trow were the greatest of the threats faced by humanity, and only the power of the Sun Hammer, a weapon capable of turning entire cities to slag, would be sufficient to counter them. But the construction of such an item would take time that the Empire did not have so long as the Trow were focused upon its destruction. To buy time for the creation of the Sun Hammer, the Cathbruig needed some way to divert the attention of the Children of Nyx. Mildred suggested that it was the Ogre who might be Lancafin's salvation, for he had learned that the Trow enslaved them not by force, but with a powerful enthralling magic that ensured their compliance. If Mildred could counter this magic and teach the liberated Ogre how to likewise free the rest of their race, a bloody rebellion could be ignited within the Iron Empire itself, and the Trow would be forced to withdraw their forces from the human lands. But even if this daring plan could succeed, the other threats remained. Moagim may have retreated from Lancafin, but he now swept through the lightly defended heartlands of the Empire, burning towns and villages from the Downs to the 12 Duns, and harvesting corpses to feed his army of the dead. Ravanna could not idle in Lancafin whilst her people were butchered, nor could Damas, now deeply in love with her, permit the princess to depart alone. The Watcher, meanwhile, was as much a danger as the Leveler, as even Moagim could not match his knowledge of necromancy, and among men, only Murdred could be said to be anywhere approaching his equal in sorcery. And as the war continued, some terrible sickness tightened its grip on the Emperor, clouding Leitrim's mind and forcing him to rely more and more on the Council of Majaran. Connacht now faces these threats with stony determination, for he knows what must be done, and why it must be done, even as he swallows his distaste for the sacrifices that must be made at the altar of destiny. Connacht's sight does not see all that will transpire, however. He does not see that the artifacts he commissioned cost more than blood and treasure, for their powers are not solely of this world. The smiths must draw from other sources, outside mortal perception, realities inhabited by other beings that have taken notice of the doorways opened into their worlds, and taken note of the prizes beyond. Nor does Connacht see the costs that will be borne by the men and women shackled to the course of his destiny, names perhaps irrelevant to the great scheme of things, but still close to Connacht's heart. And nor does he see that the destiny foretold of himself and his companions is not an arrow that flies straight and true towards its ultimate fate, but rather a pathway, meandering to and fro, occasionally splitting and reforming further down the route. He knows where their fates ultimately lead, but not always how they will get there. And what of these companions, bereft of Connacht's sight? Do they know that, even as they battle beneath the shadow of a passing comet, their stories have already been written? The heroes of the Wind Age are indeed destined for greatness, but their journey involves more than mere martial struggle. It is also one of greed and fear, of deception and betrayal, of friendships and unexpected alliances, and of loyalty and love misplaced. Their stories will be but seeds planted in the poisonous earth that is fate, seeds that 1,000 years hence will bear a bitter harvest. According to his 2020 interview, when writing Myth 3's story, Scott Campbell consulted several sources of information. His main aid was a large binder, within which were printed out pages upon pages of in-game text from the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter. On top of this, he was using the material Bungie had submitted to Take-Two, such as the original design documents, as well as canonical spin-off material such as the Tales from the Fallen Lords comic book and the officially licensed Myth 2 GURPS tabletop rulebook. In writing a prequel story, and in particular particular using these sources, Campbell was treading on dangerous ground. Spin-off material was already controversial among Myth fans. Although the comic book had been produced by the original developers, GURPS was handled by writers at Steve Jackson Games and then rubber-stamped by Bungie, making significant amounts of information within the subject of violent debates within the community over its canonicity. Moreover, simply writing a prequel story that would, officially speaking, constitute the canon account of the Fallen Lord's backstory was inevitably going to earn Campbell some enemies among the fanbase. For years leading up to the Microsoft sale, Myth fans had pored over every scrap of information they could find, seeking out old archived marketing material from the Fallen Lord's development, cracking open leaked prototype builds to compare old text with new. Though Myth had only really existed from the fans' perspective for about 2 or 3 years when it was relinquished to Take-Two, fans quickly generated a variety of wild theories and headcanon regarding the truth of Myth's mysteries. We talked a bit in the other videos about how Bungie cultivated this both in-game and through cryptic statements on message boards and the like. Without resorting to tired media narratives about toxic fan bases, let's just say that Scott Campbell's avowed aim of explaining Myth's backstory, of tying it all together, to paraphrase him, was immediately stepping on the toes of a lot of enthusiastic fans. Myth 3 was telling a story that some felt did not need to be told, that should remain part of the mythology of the setting, instead of contorted into the ungainly shape of a conventional fantasy narrative. To take the tantalizing scraps of lore referenced in passing in the Fallen Lords, so pregnant with possibility, and then just make them plain old fact, was in their view to kill what made Myth's lore so special. As you'd expect, there are plenty of comments under Gyoku's interview with Campbell lamenting that he obviously just didn't get Myth. I'll admit I struggled a little to determine Campbell's motivation for killing the golden goose, so to speak. It's possible he was trying to construct some sort of tangled but ultimately coherent web of events from across all 3 games. Sort of like how, if we were to take another video game comparison, the Legacy of Kain series kept layering new meaning on top of characters and events mentioned in the original Blood Omen. There's some value in that approach, I think. There was a moment or two when I first played Myth 3 where I had to smile at how Campbell had linked something from the Fallen Lords back to, or I should say forward to, the events of the Wolf Age. But it was hardly a masterpiece of fiendishly sophisticated intertextual relationships. That a character who deceives in Myth 3 ends up being called the Deceiver in the Fallen Lords is, well, you know. And if it was going for that approach, I was also baffled by how many missed opportunities there were, in that there are a number of character traits and relationships in the original games that were not referenced in Myth 3. Some of the tie-ins may not have even been Campbell's additions, and I think actually came from Myth GURPS, though Campbell seems to have consciously deviated from the tabletop book at various points. But there was some potential here, since an important development in Myth 3's narrative is Connacht being touched with Mazarin's sight, essentially making him quasi-omniscient. Unfortunately, the foresight this grants the hero of the light doesn't amount to any especially interesting revelations for long-time Myth fans. It doesn't radically reshape our perception of later events, nor does it add weight to events in Myth 3 that we know will culminate in something from Myth 1 or 2. There might, for example, have been some sort of operatic tragedy in Connacht's doomed attempts to escape his fate or break the cycle of the comet, or some sort of moral fable in which traits inherent to his character undo his good intentions. Or there could have been some sense of pathos in watching the heroes of the story achieve victory and peace, knowing it's all predestined to be violently reversed 1,000 years later. If Campbell was even trying for this tone, I personally never felt it. There are at least 2 moments in which Connacht laments that his foresight had not included knowledge of some sad turn of events. But these events are only sad because the narrator states that Connacht wept or that Connacht was sad, not because the characters in question were particularly important to the player. In that, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves though, discussing Myth 3 as a sort of conventional fantasy narrative with character arcs, and conventional ties of love and loss and so on. But Campbell seems to have been partly concerned with writing the Wolf Ages script in the context of the stories that originally inspired Bungie's games. We know that, in particular, Glenn Cook's The Black Company and Celtic Legends were a huge influence on the Fallen Lords. It seems that Campbell was primarily concerned with the last of these, though, repeatedly referencing works like the Ulster Cycle in his 2020 interview, rather than Glenn Cook and such. Technically, Myth 2 had already started drifting a bit from the Black Company, though it did retain the same narrative framing, the in-mission briefings being from the perspective of an in-universe journal writer. Myth 3 drops this entirely and instead opens, in the sense of the manual and intro cutscene, with the conceit of the story being a present-day journeyman's transcription of a monolith dedicated to Connacht's life and deeds. That by itself changes something about Myth's story, both in how it's presented to the player and the influences it draws from. It's fitting that Campbell focused heavily on Celtic mythology, since this is a story found carved into some ancient ruin, retelling events from thousands of years ago. That Myth 3 would feel more, well, mythological than medieval or modern is logical enough, but you feel the premise of Myth 3's narrative far less strongly than you did that of Myth 1 and 2. As we saw in the other videos, Bungie didn't go wild playing with Myth's meta-narrative. It never went the Wolfian route of implying the narrator was lying or deceptive, or that his account had been tampered with. It did, however, frequently acknowledge that Myth's story was incomplete, delivered from the perspective of a pretty minor player in the grand scheme of things, who himself often relied on third-hand accounts. It also occasionally played with the idea that the narrator was conscious of his journal as both an internal dialogue and as a text that might one day be disseminated among others.
I am not a coward. I think that my actions over the last 17 years prove this. Yet I was relieved to not be among those chosen to die.
The concept of Myth 3's narrative being recovered from an ancient shrine would seem ripe for a similar approach. The journeyman claims, for example, that the shrine is dedicated to Connacht, but is it really? There were, according to the records, 2 Connachts after all. In any case, what was the motivation behind its construction, and of the history carved into the monument? Was the shrine built to honour Connacht, or to legitimise the line of the Cathbroig emperors, no doubt some of whom, like the barbarian king, earned their throne through battle rather than conventional rules of succession? What sources were used to construct the narrative on the monument? Was it coloured by the influence of later scholars or rival political factions? Is there some strange omission from the narrative, or an area that seems to have been consciously defaced? And what are the implications of the words carved there for present-day rulers, who may well base their authority on commonly accepted accounts of the Wind Age? Nothing like this comes up, because if you didn't read the manual and skipped the opening cutscene, you'd probably have no idea that the story is being framed in this way. Instead, what we have is an account of Connacht's rise to power that we're apparently supposed to take at face value, as representative of an objective truth, just as we would a fairly conventionally told fantasy story. And this is essentially what Myth 3 is, a standard fantasy tale of heroes and villains, with monsters and great artifacts and demigods dueling with magic swords and so on. On top of this, though, there is the mythological aspect to the narrative. In the Fallen Lords, the events of the Wind or Wolf Age were revealed through fragmented accounts of great battles and names and places, not a coherent, chronologically ordered timeline of causal relationships. There were occasions in the Fallen Lords or Soulblighter when we might speculate, without incontrovertible proof, that 2 names represented the same figure, or that the same name actually represented 2 different people of separate eras and so on. This is not the case in Myth 3, but neither is it necessarily a departure from how modern readers engage with Myth 3's mythological parent works. If you're interested in reading about the Tuatha Dé Danann, for example, you're going to be reading these stories presented in a very conventional structure. There may be a lengthy academic preface to it all, but once you start reading the actual thing, you have individual stories laid out in a logical and digestible manner. A pretty standard narrative, not too different from Myth 3's. So even if we might prefer the Fallen Lords' approach to history, it's not true to say that Myth 3 is less, authentic to mythological stories than Bungie's version. Choosing to present only a certain amount of information about the story, and inviting the player to interpret what they've been given, is no less artificial than Scott Campbell's approach of constructing a traditional fantasy narrative out of Connacht's life. I mean, how many people today enjoy Irish legends in the form of multiple, overlapping, sometimes contradictory accounts transcribed across several hundred years and written in various languages, some of which were themselves merely translations of an an earlier tongue? Or at the very least, how common is it for these stories to be contextualized as the product of later writers compiling, cataloging, or reinterpreting them for the people of their day, instead of merely the myths and legends of this or that culture? Campbell obviously went for the tone of these works, not the interpretive elements of their presentation, and if there's one thing you can say for sure about the Wolf Age, it's that it's certainly very Celtic. In their review of the game, Joystick magazine joked that half the names were unpronounceable to French speakers, which is probably more true than they knew, since many of the in-game pronunciations, which I've used in this video, are in fact at odds with even the standard anglicised versions. But more importantly, what they were getting at was that whilst the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter certainly had roots in Gaelic or Brythonic mythology, Myth 3 boasts of its Celtic heritage with an unparalleled ardour. But how much of those stories did Campbell capture in the Wolf Age, aside from surface-level references? On some level, Myth 3's narrative is in line with the most famous aspects of these heroic sagas. Warriors slaying scores of men single-handedly, heroes and villains dueling with legendary weapons and armor, demigods with sorcerous and shape-shifting powers. Again, this was present in the older games, but comes across more overtly in the Wolf Age. What it does fall short in, though, is capturing some of the more colourful elements of those tales. In the Táin, for example, the central conflict between the kingdoms of Connaught and Ulster is instigated by a post-coital marital dispute between two overly prideful rulers, and the centrality of the hero Cuchulainn in the war is due to the Ulstermen being rendered helpless by period cramps inflicted on them by a vengeful goddess. These tales are full of great battles and dueling champions, sure, sometimes to the point of tedium, but they also feature scenes like the Hound of Ulster, seized by a berserker rage, being halted in his rampage by the sight of his victims' womenfolk baring their breasts to him, which shames Cuchulainn so thoroughly that he averts his eyes and is wrestled into cold water to cure his bloodlust. In another scene, the hero defeats a warrior woman, sparing her on the condition that she bears his child, who in turn grows up to be a hero in his own right, leading to a tragic encounter with his father. Myth 3 takes only the most well-worn elements of these sagas, the battles and magic artifacts, and even those develop more predictably than in the original works. Conflicts are won due to skill at arms, strength of magic, or military maneuvers like flanking or ambushes, rather than the more nuanced portrayals of the Ulster stories. Similarly, characters are very one-sided in Myth 3, which you would assume is true of mythological figures, but most great men of the cycles, just as in the legends of many other cultures, evidence extremes of personality, at the very least displays of great heroism or valour paired with murderous jealousy or rage. Myth 3's leads are pretty standard heroes and villains. At worst, Connaught is understandably overconfident, Damas is slightly prideful and impulsive, and so on. And when they do commit morally questionable deeds, they're contextually far more justifiable than the crimes of the protagonists in the Ulster cycle. They grieve for their allies, but not their enemies, since their enemies are genocidal tyrants or ancient evils. Now, this is mostly the case with Bungie's games as well. The Wars of the Táin were sometimes morally grey affairs, often involving mundane tribal disputes, cross-border raids, matters of wounded pride and honour, and in some cases, perhaps merely retellings of prehistorical cycles of migration and invasion in the British Isles, not necessarily battles of good versus evil. The Fallen Lords and Soulblighter were, however, relatively uncomplicated in their morality, light versus dark. The implications and relevance to the Black Company we talked a bit about in the other videos. However, due to their framing, our knowledge of these events was incomplete. We know that two demigod-like figures clashed in battle, but we don't know what they were doing in the meantime. We don't know whether Ulrich healed himself by tricking the Deceiver into drinking cow milk, for example, or whether any of the unnamed Fallen Lords were killed with a slingshot and a piece of cheese. We sometimes have hints of stranger, less conventional things in titles or flavour text. It doesn't matter whether Bungie intended for some of those to be interpreted in that way, only that they engineered it to be so. With Myth 3, that excuse doesn't fly, since we're following these characters somewhat as we would those of a regular narrative, and when there does seem to be information missing, we attribute this to bad writing or cut content. So coming back to the question we picked up earlier then, how do the characters work not as mythological figures but as conventional fantasy heroes? Well again, there are difficulties in judging them according to these criteria, because despite their importance to the narrative, there are long periods of Myth 3's story where we don't know all that much about what Connacht, Damas, Merdred and Ravana are thinking or doing. By narrative, obviously I'm including the missions themselves, whereas Myth 1 and 2 were from the perspective of an unnamed minor side character, and in mission predominantly featured random little gaggles of men rather than the commanders of the light. Myth 3 is supposed to focus on Connacht and his companions, but it doesn't. Not entirely, anyway. Out of 25 missions, I think something like 11 include Connacht, 5 involve Damas, 4 have Merdred, and poor Ravana is only in 3. 10 of the single-player missions, nearly half in total, have either no named characters or just brief appearances by side characters. Now, these characters are obviously quite frequently mentioned in the pre-mission briefings, but in mission you only see the main character, that dude on both the box art and the title screen, for about 50% of the in-game action, and the other 3 leads get even less time. And even in mission, they often have minimal dialogue.
Thank you, my friend. You fight like a wolf.
No time to speak. More devils approach.
Under these conditions, it's very difficult to get attached to these characters or appreciate their struggles and relationship to each other. We're told in a static cutscene around Mission 6 that Damas and Ravana met and quarrelled, then in the briefing to Mission 6 that they were becoming closer, then in the briefing to Mission 16 that they were inseparable, and once more in the ending cutscene. And that's probably the deepest and most fleshed out relationship in the entire game. I'm pretty sure that the side character of Kruniak in Myth 2, who, if I recall correctly, has absolutely zero cutscenes and no spoken dialogue in the entire game, and who is only discussed in the opening missions, had more of a character arc than the leads in Myth 3. The irony here is that this might have worked in Myth 1 or 2, where the entire point of the journal is that we're only getting glimpses of these characters, and are invited to speculate as to their movements and motivations throughout the rest of the game. So for a character-driven story, Myth 3 doesn't really work so well. But this also extends to the scope and scale of Myth 3's storytelling, which Campbell was very focused on in his original pitch, and I think fails here for similar reasons. The events being covered in the Wolf Age were characterized in earlier games as so momentous or cataclysmic that they almost defied description. The rise and fall of empires at the height of their power and splendor, the annihilation of civilizations, heroes wielding artifacts of such power that they could destroy entire cities. In those games, some of these events were not even necessarily concurrent to each other, but occurred ages apart. In Myth 3, they all happened together, before the player's very eyes. And both many fans and many reviewers felt they did not live up to the hype. I have to agree that pretty much all these legendary events are rather timid affairs in-game. Let's start with the Mircridia. I agree with many fans that these do not feel like the same beasts described in earlier games. Connacht's victory against them was described in terms akin to some sort of godlike feat in the Fallen Lords, and 1,000 years later the mere sight of physical proof of their historicism terrifies the legionnaires who stumble across it. In Myth 3, Gower's first victory against them involves about 20 good men defending a bunch of rocks. The game then skips over, quote, many great battles, unquote, in which Connacht unites an entire nation, then plops him and a few Zerks in a stealth level where they kill a couple of packs and a giant or two depending on the difficulty. Thus ends the first great campaign of Connacht's legendary career. The Mircridia are barely present for the next few missions, and then Connacht gets the Tain and vacuums up little groups of 5 or 6, storms a castle with a small group of men, and the Mircridia are finished. Now, in fairness, like I said in the previous video, I think Bungie themselves already made the mistake of blowing their proverbial load with the Mircridia, leaving Scott Campbell with the sticky aftermath. We've already seen the Mircridia depicted in a way that arguably didn't live up to their reputation. On the other hand, that version of the Mircridia was not meant to represent the continuation of the race that had been ravaging the world for hundreds of years. They were still in fact reconstructing their civilization, such as it might have been. Myth 3 once more can't use that excuse. These Mircridia are the real deal, and their defeat should feel like the culmination of a Herculean struggle for supremacy. Where are the Mircridian kings mentioned in the Fallen Lords? lords? Where is the bestial race that consumed towns and cities, made wastelands of entire kingdoms? Surely in this age, the Mirkridia would be led by more fearsome leaders, or count among them more elite breeds. These Mirkridia seem much the same as the degenerated creatures of the earlier game, perhaps a little stringier due to the polygonal models, and overall more of an NPC race and adventuring party might beat down than an empire-ending threat. Now, the Trow I think come off a little better. Unlike the Mirkridia, they are depicted as being at a far greater level of development than Myth 1 or 2, clad in armour and leading hordes of slave soldiers. I would, however, expect a bit more military sophistication to an empire that had been conquering rivals for several thousand years, and the Trow cities are a bit less grand than I'd have envisioned them. But MumboJumbo sort of cheated here, since we only see auxiliary troops sent to aid MumboJumbo, plus outlying mines and temples under construction prior to the Ogre Rebellion. When the player actually visits the Trow's homes, they've already undergone years of internal strife, and have begun retreating from their reliance on iron. Essentially, the Trow Empire has already semi-collapsed by the time the player reaches its heart. But even with the ass pull, Connacht's final victory over the Children of Nyx, the end of a civilization that has ruled virtually unopposed for time immemorial, isn't all that impressive. When Connacht was described as having melted entire cities with the Sun Hammer, I don't think anyone was thinking a bunch of dudes running around a sparsely populated map and pressing T when they got close to a big empty building, occasionally stumbling across random Trow out on their morning perambulation. You're probably seeing the pattern here. Myth 3 tries to represent conflicts that, even according to its own timeline, last years or decades, and involve massive expenditures of manpower and magic, apocalyptic clashes of massed armies, but represents them with a couple of critical battles. These battles, in turn, only involve controlling a small force of troops who encounter slightly larger groupings of enemies one after another. In some cases, these battles do not even include the key figures involved, like Connacht or Murdred, but rather regular units. This extends beyond the Trow and Mirkridian conflicts to the war as a whole. When MumboJumbo launches his surprise attack on Lancafin, for example, virtually every major named character in the game is supposedly present. But in-game, we merely control a random group of defenders protecting a single part of the walls, and not a single relevant character makes an appearance. We learn later that MumboJumbo personally assaulted the walls on multiple occasions, sword cutting down Herrenguard and magics blasting away, which would have been cool if we'd actually seen it. And there are numerous other levels in which the pre-mission briefing indicates Connacht, Murdred, or Damas were present, but then leaves them out of the mission. There are numerous missions that almost feel like filler, like Children of Belial, which is especially odd considering how rushed the main events of Connacht's life are. It's not like they should have been struggling to think of content. One of the few missions that seems appropriate to the events being described is the Spider God, since it makes sense this internal occult threat would involve a sort of dungeon crawl through the darkness. Of course, this is exactly what the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter did. Instead of following the leaders of the Light and depicting large-scale battles between the Alliance and the Fallen Lords, their campaigns usually focused on patrols, rearguard actions, infiltrations, and seemingly menial tasks that turned out to be of greater importance later on. This worked very well for most of the Fallen Lords, complementing the narrative framing of a journal written by someone with the regular archers and infantrymen doing important grunt work, rather than the great magi or elite troops. Small-scale missions with the occasional set-piece assault worked very well, and actually made the major battles we didn't see, battles involving thousands of troops versus tens or hundreds of thousands of undead, the ground shaking with the force of destructive magics, seem even more epic in our imagination. In Soulblighter, this didn't necessarily work quite as well, but it tried to both enhance the scale and recontextualize things. There are missions in which we assault keeps or fortresses, not with hundreds of men, but still at a larger scale than the Fallen Lords. And there are missions where we are leading desperate escapes or assassination missions that make sense within the narrative. Once more, Myth 3 has shed its protection and left itself open to criticism. The era depicted is not the twilight following an earlier, more cataclysmic period as in the Fallen Lords, or the clash of two factions still recovering from a previous war like in Soulblighter. It's meant to be taking place in a time involving even greater magics, even larger armies, and even more powerful and heroic figures than the wars mentioned in the first two games. It's also also meant to be directly about those things, the great battles, the legendary heroes, not about a random conscript freezing his arse off in a drafty tent, grumbling about how much better the guys in the main camp have it. We're supposed to be reliving the legend of Connacht, so why then are we following a bunch of random soldiers instead of the heroes of the story? Why are we controlling 20 men in a swamp instead of thousands on the battlefield? Why do these renowned artifacts teleport away a handful of enemies, or swap out the model on a building, instead of brushing aside armies or burying entire cities? Everything in Myth 3 is supposed to be infinitely grander than the previous two games, but much of it is on roughly the same scope and scale, and the handful that exceed this are nowhere near what the audience expects from them. Yet again, the absurdity of all this is that had Myth 3 utilised a similar approach to the Fallen Lords, not necessarily a soldier's journal but a framing device of some sort, this problem could have been neutralised in part or whole. Had the narrative been presented in such a way as to justify to the player why they were being told certain things but not others, why certain characters' internal thoughts or comings and goings were being concealed from them, why they were not leading the nation of Gower against the Micridian hordes but instead running around in a cave, then the story might have worked. But that wasn't how Myth 3 was presented, and it's in part why Myth 3's story doesn't work. Why then didn't Campbell go this route, considering it was already the established convention for the series? Well, much of that question has already been answered. He had no choice. Remember, as per Campbell's own admission, he had pitched Myth 3 as an epic story of great battles and unprecedented scope for the series, cognizant of the fact that these promises were most likely to secure Contraband the contract. To play devil's advocate for Gathering of developers, it's not unreasonable to imagine that a pitch along the lines of the Fallen Lords, in which the story was consciously not about the most exciting stuff, and that followed some random nobody and barely featured the heroes and villains, would have seemed far less attractive than Campbell's pitch. And once the contract was signed, the team relocated to form MumboJumbo, they now had to deliver on that pitch. The consequences of that are clear in the 2001 design doc, not only contained in the text itself, but revealed through a comparison with the final product. Despite the design doc already being heavily revised to fit the limited budget, there are several cutscenes missing from the final game that help explain some of the inconsistencies in the story, like mission briefings that don't match the previous or subsequent scenes. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, a number of cinematics that were to be done in-game or in-engine had to be converted to static sketches or photoshopped screenshots with a voiceover, robbing several scenes of their impact. The document is a good reminder of just how little dialogue there is in mission in the final game, even those with the heroes present, which seem especially strange when you keep in mind how much exposition is delivered by the narrator, a very common complaint of reviewers. Once again, budgetary concerns are probably the culprit here. I imagine it's far cheaper and convenient to have one guy sit down and record a few hours of monologuing than paying multiple voice actors having a conversation, even when it's not for a scripted cutscene. And the issue of budget and time limitations is a reminder of how, ultimately, it's unfair to spend too much time backseat driving Scott Campbell's script. If we compare the few changes made to the story between the 2001 doc and the final game, it's clear that Campbell or someone at MumboJumbo did make some enhancements to Myth 3's script to bring it a bit closer to conventional storytelling techniques. In the design doc, for example, Damas and Ravana begin the game already married, so the whole minor subplot about them bickering, then growing closer, then falling in love was a later revision. But that sort of change had to be made in the context of not only Campbell's script being rushed, but that any changes to the writing would have to be made before the recording sessions for the voice actors were booked. Almost none of Myth 3's story, bar the manual and unit flavor text, was on-voiced, so it would have been very tricky to make modifications without derailing the project's on-negotiable 11-month development cycle. All of the suggestions we might make to improve Myth 3's writing, even as a traditional fantasy story, had undoubtedly already been considered, and then discarded by Campbell and his crew, simply due to the practical issues involved. All that said, I think the central problem remains the basis on which Myth 3 rested, Campbell's original pitch. Even if everything from the 2001 doc had been included without any cuts, I still doubt it would have been anywhere remotely close to the tale Campbell envisioned in his original pitch. The fact is, the original Myth engine was never designed for the purposes of simulating massive conflicts on the scale of the Wolf Age's premise. There are a few differing accounts of how Jason Jones' initial work on the engine evolved into Myth, but none of them involve gigantic 1,000+ men battles. 100 guys versus another 100 guys in 3D 3D is the closest to this I've heard. That's not to say RTS engines not expressly designed for the purpose could not be used to depict traditional character-driven stories or epic battles between nations and empires, aided by high production values or various technological tricks. But the Fallen Lords and Soulblighter engines were better suited to moderately sized skirmishes, not intensely detailed squad-level or CRPG party tactics, nor commanding entire armies. If anything, Campbell's original pitch sounds like it would have been a better fit for Creative Assembly's Taisho engine, or whatever it was originally called. In some ways, it might be argued that Myth 3's story was a victim of not just budgetary issues, but the same issue Richard Cowgill suggested had plagued the game as a whole, that the Myth series was outdated. After the Fallen Lords, Jason Jones' sci-fi spiritual successor continually drifted further and further from the formula Bungie had pioneered, and after Soulblighter, Team Phoenix explored numerous potential ideas for their next title: a fantasy siege simulator with destructible environments, a space trading game, a sci-fi post-apocalyptic title, and various other concepts. Who knows, maybe a Myth dating sim was in there somewhere. Even the supposed Myth 3 pitch, the authenticity of which I wasn't able to confirm, indicates it was moving in a somewhat different direction, both in gameplay and in setting. Was it a mistake for the Wolf Age to imitate the game design as a whole and merely expound upon old material? Should Campbell have tried to do something more radical? Maybe, maybe not. Just as with the legends that inspired Scott Campbell's script, some stories will be eternally told. Even after Bungie broke fans' hearts and opened their legs for Steve Ballmer, many Myth fans still wanted to experience more stories of the light and the dark. Scott Campbell had one such story for them, and no matter their motivation, the Myth 3 team overcame adversity to bring that story to life in October 2001, no matter how scuffed or compromised it may have been. It was the last time, officially speaking, Myth fans were able to enjoy tales from the world of the Fallen Lords. And though it may have had its shortcomings, perhaps more people should appreciate the Wolf Age for giving them that opportunity. This video feels a lot like an epilogue or an epitaph, not to my Soulblighter video, but to the one I originally did on the Fallen Lords. There I said, quite frankly, that Myth's failure to spawn a new subgenre didn't really bother me very much. It had its innovations for the time, but it never quite proved the necessity of its half-and-half approach to strategy and tactics. For the tactical side, I personally preferred proper squad-level or CRPG mechanics, and for the strategic sweep of battle, it was hard to go back to conventional RTS after the Total War series. Myth's strength was in its unique storytelling, remarkable audio-visual finesse, and the general polish Bungie brought to the table. The Wolf Age, I think, only cements the truth of that statement. Working from a story pitch designed for a grander sort of game, then shackled to this pitch on an insufficient budget and forced to deliver a product on lower production values, and in such a short time frame that there was no time for polish, the end result is hardly a surprise. Myth 3 is mostly a retread of the first two games, minus many of the things that made Bungie's titles so attractive. To this day, even running on fan patches, the Wolf Age is poorly paced and balanced, inconsistent in its presentation, and telling a story its developers did not intend to tell in this manner, if, indeed, that story should even have been told at all. What's left are the basics of Myth. A linear, mission-based campaign without any kind of persistence, shallow real-time tactics, a rotatable camera, and sometimes awkward unit controls. But is this a reflection of MumboJumbo's shortcomings, or of Bungie's original formula? For some franchises, the basic gameplay can be enough to stand on its own. Personally, I can still enjoy some of the worst of the Total War games, for example. But Myth, I think, has its limits when not buttressed with other attractions. For those fans not spellbound by its story, that was Myth's multiplayer, but thanks to the death of GameSpy and alternative fan servers, even that is denied to anyone interested in Myth 3. A shame for sure, and all in all, the Wolf Age is a difficult game to recommend to someone who isn't interested in the history of the Myth series, or who wants to acknowledge the hard work and creative energy that led to it being released in the first place. But as strange as it might sound, I think some of these shortcomings make Myth 3 an even better candidate for a re-release than the first two games. Although Myth 1 and 2 are most deserving of it, they're also the least to benefit from quick and dirty fixes. Being sprite-based games, with Myth 1 already almost perfectly ported to the second game, and the most consistently supported with fan patches and updates, their number one barrier to preservation is simply their absence from digital distribution stores. Myth 3, however, being polygonal 3D already, and with a number of surface-level technical problems, I think would gain the most from an HD re-release, even if it didn't try to touch the deeper problems with the engine. In the event that never happens, though, it's probably best that those curious about the Myth series look into Myth 2 and its community. On that subject, I wanted to add a little addendum to my other videos and mention that Myth modding legend John God recently completed an alternative version of the Fallen Lords port for Myth 2, which is aimed at those who want an even more faithful reproduction of the first game than the original Fallen Levels mod. Give it a try if you're curious, and it's a great excuse for a replay if you haven't revisited the Myth series in a while. And as always, if you're a new player or just want to reconnect with the Myth community, drop by the friendly Mirgard server. I'd like to once again recommend Bungie fans in general check out Jyoku's channel, who conducted the Scott Campbell interview that I used as the basis for this video. He also has a more recent interview with Bungie's Doug Zartman, as well as countless videos on many other classic Bungie titles. Finally, I'd like to recommend Bungie fans or people interested in the gaming industry in general visit the Fourth Curtain podcast Discord, which is run by former Bungie CEO Alex Seropian, and features interviews with many famous figures from gaming's good old days. The Discord channel is often frequented by both Bungie fans and former staff. It's actually where I stumbled across the original Myth pitches and some other info I wasn't aware of whilst working on the previous videos. Of course, making this video wouldn't have been possible without still living Myth fan sites and file hosts, such as The Tane, Hotline Myth, Project Magma, Bungie.org, and others. And a very special thanks to Scott Campbell and Rachel Clark of White Moon Dreams, Craig Matchett of Blizzard Entertainment, Jyoku and John God of the Myth community, those I spoke to off the record, and finally all the posters in the Mirgard and Fourth Curtain Discord for their assistance. Thank you for keeping Myth alive. And that's all, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this video and the previous two entries if you've seen those. Maybe they brought back some good memories, revealed some secrets you were unaware of, or maybe you don't really care about Myth and just found the topic an interesting one, which is always my hope with these retrospectives. And sorry for taking so long on these videos. Real life and a 24-hour construction site next to my window have been slowing me down. Nevertheless, I'll be starting work on another video now, which will be Gremlin Graphics' Turn of the Millennium action RPG Soulbringer, a game I've been meaning to cover almost since the start of my channel. No time frame for that one, but as always, I will be chipping away at it behind the scenes. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful 2024, and remember to stay comfy. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Sleep tight.